Are we ready to get started?
I think you're good, Dr. Larsen.
Okay, thank you. Well, good morning to you all. Happy Tuesday, and welcome to the first of 2 Delta Salinity Management workshops planned for 2022. Before I get going, I would like to acknowledge that the Delta and the larger Bay estuary are located within the ancestral territory of the native peoples of the numerous villages and tribes of the Bay Miwok, Coast Miwok, Plains Miwok, Maidu, Ohlone, Patwin, Pomo, Wapo, Wintun, and Yokuts, who make up tribal groups both recognized and unrecognized. We recognize that these people have continually occupied the Bay Delta area for thousands of years. Through a violent history of colonization and dispossession, we as guests benefit from living and working on the traditional homeland of these native people. We wish to show our respect to them, their ancestors, and their sovereignty by acknowledging the injustices inherent in this history and their current efforts to achieve restorative justice. We acknowledge the ancestors, elders, and relatives and affirm their sovereign rights as First Peoples. We acknowledge that the Delta Stewardship Council, Delta Science Program, and other organizations represented here today are benefiting from the displacement and dispossession of Native people from their traditional homelands. Consistent with the values of community, inclusion, and diversity, it is vitally important that we recognize that the land on which we reside is unceded tribal territory and acknowledge and support the Native peoples who continue to form a crucial part of the Bay Delta community today. We also acknowledge that Native peoples remain dedicated to fulfilling their obligation to the Creator to care for Mother Earth and all living things and return sacredness to the land through the restoration of traditional knowledge and stewardship throughout the Bay Delta. There is much we need to learn from the Bay Delta's tribal communities who have been stewarding our natural environment since time immemorial. Although this statement acknowledges the ancestral and unceded territories of the original Native peoples of the Bay Delta, we recognize that additional steps are required to move towards meaningful restorative justice. It is our hope that this workshop will contribute toward building beneficial and constructive relationships that support tribes in restoring their role as land stewards and elevating and integrating Native communities in the planning and decision-making for a healthy and resilient Bay Delta. Well, thank you all for being here today. And thanks to all who have worked behind the scenes to make this workshop a reality. I am excited to report that we have close to 100 registrants for this workshop series, which reflects a high level of interest in a topic that represents one of California's biggest challenges in drought management, and that will become one of the biggest challenges in managing the Delta as climate extremes become more frequent and as sea level rises. Brandon, could you please advance the slides? These 2 stressors, reduced freshwater inflows at the upstream end of the Delta and increased sea level rise at the downstream end, next, put the Delta in a highly vulnerable position with respect to salinity, as is recognized in the Delta Adapts Vulnerability Assessment released by the Delta Stewardship Council in 2021. This vulnerable position is not necessarily lessened by the climate change projections that wet extremes will substantially increase in frequency through the rest of the century. Because more of that precipitation will fall as rain rather than snow and during shorter bursts of time, making it harder to capture, we may be facing smaller dry season inflows to the Delta even during wet years. And importantly, the recent droughts have been extreme because of abnormally high temperatures rather than abnormally low rainfall, which the vulnerability assessment recognizes as another major stressor linked to salinity in the Delta. One thing I like about this middle diagram depicted on this slide is that it shows that the stressors facing the Delta span the landscape from upstream to downstream, which implies the necessity of coordinating across boundaries, both jurisdictional and disciplinary. It also implies the need to understand the impacts of actions taken upstream, downstream, or within the Delta at a landscape scale. Models that are used to evaluate trade-offs of management actions over a range of spatial scales provide an appropriate tool to meet this need and inform a planning process grounded in risk assessment. With the growing recognition that the times that we live in are unprecedented, next slide. And one good example of this is the March 22nd Nature Climate Change Report that the Southwest has not seen the likes of the current long-term drought in 1,200 years. Interagency teams and groups have increasingly called for formal coordination and long-term planning based on forward-looking models. Action 6B in the Science Action Agenda, released just recently on Earth Day, underscores this priority in its call to evaluate the cumulative impacts and trade-offs of drought management actions on ecological and human communities over multiple timescales. Meanwhile, the Science Needs Assessment Work Group calls for agencies and individuals to come together collaboratively to develop predictions of how the Delta will respond to climate change, as well as interventions to mitigate climate change's effects. Next slide. With respect to salinity management, excuse me, the possible interventions or tools in our toolkit are many, including traditional engineering, nature-based solutions, regulatory actions, flow actions, and demand management. Alternative tools such as traditional engineering barriers like the barrier across the False River, or nature-based solutions such as the designed wetland restoration around the Franks Tract, which you see on the right diagram, may realize similar goals with respect to salinity management in the Central and South Delta, but have vastly differing trade-offs on other parts of the system, such as ecosystems, agriculture, economics, and other aspects of human livelihoods. These trade-offs, both positive and negative, have yet to be examined in detail. Further, it is important to recognize that actions taken to achieve management objectives seemingly unrelated to salinity management, such as habitat objectives, next slide, can have big impacts on salinity management as well. This slide from John DeGeorge at RMA shows how different configurations of tidal marsh restoration around Sassoon Bay can have very different impacts on salinity in the South and Central Delta, which argues further for a landscape scale approach in planning for the future. Next slide. Our goal in this series of salinity management workshops is to catalyze a systematic, collaborative, adaptive management approach to salinity management in light of future challenges. Salinity management is hard. There are distinct winners and losers associated with our management actions. Collaborative visioning processes ensure that voices are heard before a project or strategy is designed. They build more transparency into the modeling process, and they give communities ownership over the solutions that are designed. Through vesting these voices in the modeling process, they help make all parties familiar with the science and what it says about the pros, cons, and limitations of each of the alternatives, and they can bring these parties to a position of compromise and or consensus. Now I'm going to turn it over to Karen Kayfetz, who will give an overview of how we will launch that process through our series of workshops.
Thanks, Laurel. Thank you so much for setting up the vision. I will now pivot us and talk about the execution, how we're going to approach our work together over the next couple of days and over the next so many months. One small correction that I'll make, Laurel, as you said, there were about 100 registrants. There's actually around 200 registrants, and more than 100 of them are online right now. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today. Next slide. I want to talk for a second about the goals that our planning committee put together, and I'm going to go ahead and read you at least most of these verbatim because we spent a lot of time really thinking together about the language that we were using to capture these workshop series goals. So the first goal that we want to work towards, that we're going to devote quite a lot of time to in today's program, is building a shared understanding of the range of issues associated with ocean salt intrusion in the Delta and the different salinity management tools and strategies that could be used. So Laurel gave a few examples of engineering solutions, of nature-based solutions, and alluded to how there are very different trade-offs for people and for the environment, given those different solutions. And so a large part of our purpose today is to come together and to learn from each other about what these issues are. The second goal is identifying the knowledge gaps that must be filled and scenario-based modeling work that could be done to evaluate socioeconomic and ecological impacts and trade-offs of different salinity management tools and strategies. A lot of our work tomorrow, especially, we will start into this work a little bit today, but a lot of our work tomorrow will be looking at different ways of capturing scenarios, of talking about scenarios, so that we can evaluate what are the trade-offs, what are the benefits, what are the compromises that people make for these different socioeconomic and ecological goals. And the third, which will really start kind of throughout these 2 days, but that will be a longer ongoing process, as Laurel alluded to, is laying the groundwork for a collaborative adaptive management approach to salinity management. So we'll have a session today and another session tomorrow where we'll get at learning about some of the goals and metrics for evaluation. And over the course of this salinity management workshop series and all of the involved work, we're trying to identify partners who will engage on an ongoing basis within the workshops and after these workshops to build an adaptive management framework. Next slide. So just getting into a little bit of the nuts and bolts of how we're scheduling things. Like I said, today we're meeting, tomorrow we're meeting, we're framing up the challenges, we're working on that shared understanding, beginning to identify knowledge gaps, and starting that conversation around the long-term goal. Over the summer, we're going to convene a few focused working group meetings to continue the conversation around the management scenarios that will be presented tomorrow, and I'll go into more detail on that in just a second. We'll foster some deeper discussions in those working group meetings about the impacts and trade-offs and continue to generate more ideas about what we need to evaluate to really understand how these actions affect people, affect their livelihoods, and affect our ecosystem. We will use those focus working group meetings to generate a set of pilot scenarios that will be evaluated with computer models. And our goal is to do that evaluation by October. So this is a pilot exercise. We're not going to evaluate every possible scenario, and we're not going to be able to evaluate every impact and trade-off. But what we are able to model in that short timeline, we'll bring to this October workshop. And so in October, we'll compare the modeling outputs from those pilot scenarios, discuss some of the trade-offs, and use that as a way to dig deeper into the conversation, refining our ideas about future research and scenario-based modeling needs, and continuing that work, like I said, it's ongoing of identifying partners and a plan for creating that collaborative adaptive management framework. Next slide. So today, we're kicking things off with an introductory keynote address from John Leahigh, Water Operations Manager for the State Water Project at the Department of Water Resources. He'll help give us some background to build on our shared understanding of how salinity management currently works and how it's getting more challenging in the face of severe and recurring droughts and other climate change impacts. The rest of our morning will be dedicated to panel discussions, first on the social dimensions of the problem, and then on the operational and scientific challenges. After lunch, we reconvene for breakout discussions. Our goal here is to learn from participants about your diverse priorities and values. After another short break, we'll close the day with reports from the breakout groups and some open discussion time. The day will close at 3:30. When we reconvene tomorrow, we'll hear again from Delta lead scientist Dr. Laurel Larsen about a pilot exercise to model the effects of some potential future climate and salinity management scenarios, and then we'll go into breakout groups to discuss and get your feedback on the proposed pilot exercise and gather your input on what metrics matter to you and how we can model or measure them. In the afternoon, after lunch, we'll reconvene to hear reports from the breakout groups and then transition into a closing panel discussion regarding creating an adaptive management framework for managing salinity. And I just want to take a beat to mention here that the plenary, the panel discussions, the shared group sessions, those are going to be recorded, but the breakout groups, those are not going to be recorded. So you can rewatch the panel discussions at any time, rewatch the plenary talk at any time. Those breakout group discussions are going to be really fostering an environment where everybody can speak openly. And so we'll be taking some notes, but not recording those sessions. Next slide, please. Okay, just briefly want to thank our planning committee members who represent a variety of state, federal, and local agencies and academic institutions. It's been incredible working together as a team to build an agenda around including a broad variety of perspectives on this topic. Thank you all for your dedication to furthering the conversation. Next slide. A few things that I wanted to mention before we get into the rest of the meeting. Some expectations for engagement over these 2 days. We want to acknowledge that there's a long history of conflict associated with salinity management in the Delta, and it's our goal to hear from all voices and perspectives, including those that have been previously marginalized, and work towards resolution of conflicts. With this goal in mind, we ask participants to please abide by these guidelines for engagement. First, start from a place of assuming good intentions by all participants. Second, acknowledge that we may have different objectives and priorities. Truly listen to others with respect and try to understand perspectives that may be different from your own. Third, create a welcoming, safe environment for all voices to be heard. Consciously refrain from dominating conversations, and conversely work to help amplify quiet or minority voices. And then finally, please understand that it's our group's mission not to endorse any particular management strategies or to recommend policy. Rather, our aim is to present decision makers with a robust scientific analysis of likely long-term trade-offs of possible salinity management actions. Next slide. All right. So now with the housekeeping out of the way, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Mr. John Leahigh. Mr. Leahigh is the Water Operations Executive Manager for the State Water Project at the Department of Water Resources. He has a master's in civil engineering with an emphasis in water resource management from Sacramento State University. With over 27 years of water operations experience with the State Water Project and Central Valley Project, and primary responsibility for meeting Delta salinity standards, Mr. Leahigh is uniquely equipped to orient us to the challenges of managing salinity in this system. So we're going to take our screen share down now, and I'll invite Mr. Leahigh to share your screen and share your presentation. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. And go ahead and share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. So yeah, thank you, Karen. I heard you say there's well over 100 participants here today. It'd be nice if I was looking over an auditorium and I see familiar smiling faces looking this way, but at least I can see some familiar names on the screen here. So
we're not seeing your screen yet.
Okay. Let me give that a shot again. How about now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Yeah, there we go. Okay, yes, thank you, Karen. I want to thank this Delta Science program for the invitation to share my knowledge and unique perspective on Delta's salinity management. I hope my unique perspective here, based on my experience and function as water project operator, and I appreciate that there are certainly other perspectives, as you've mentioned, Karen, on Delta salinity management. I'm here based on my expertise, and the views expressed here do not necessarily represent the official policy of the Department of Water Resources. So here's a breakdown of what I'm going to cover in my presentation today. So kind of a mile wide, a couple feet deep. So the first couple topics there just kind of get us grounded with basic delta. And I apologize, this I'm going to have to get out of the full view here, and we'll have to work it from here. Slides are kind of advancing on me. I'll briefly cover the geography, topography, and delta hydrodynamics, which is really important to set the foundation moving forward, so that I'll spend a lot more time here on how the projects actually manage the salinity conditions, go over some of the lessons learned through the recent droughts, and how future anticipated changes associated with climate could affect things moving forward. So first of all, I really appreciate that introduction by Laurel Larsen on Native American history and connection to this space. But also our magnificent delta here is, of course, where the freshwaters of the Sacramento and its tributaries meet the San Joaquin and its tributaries meet with the brackish water of the bay. And our delta is, of course, a classic inverted delta, since the narrow channel is at the outward seaward part of the delta at the Cardenas Straits. So what else can we say about the delta? Well, it covers close to 3/4 of a million acres, 55,000 acres of which are surface water, includes over 1,100 miles of levees, provides recreation for millions of users. It is the largest estuary on the west coast of both North and South America, so supporting majority of the state's commercial salmon fishery. It conveys water to support California's $3.4 trillion economy, as measured in 2021, which we often hear, if we're a separate country, would be represent the 5th largest in terms of economy. And it provides drinking water for over 27 million people. So that's at least two thirds of the state's population receives at least part of their water supply that's conveyed through the delta. So backing up a bit, back to the natural state, it was a series of branching channels, in some respects similar to today, although those channels were constantly in a state of flux. Channels and sloughs. There was also a seasonal wetland aspect to it, where during the winter flooded period, we see freshwater largely dominating the estuary, and the summer shallow channels and more saline ocean water would intrude into the delta. So contrast that with the modern delta, which is a highly managed system with of course, the reservoirs that have been constructed on nearly all the major tributaries that feed the Bay Delta system, which have altered that hydrology. There are gates and barriers, which I'm going to go into more detail later in the discussion. The pumps, hundreds of diversion locations throughout the delta, most significant export operations existing in the south part of the delta for the State Water Project at Banks Pumping Plant, and for the Federal Central Valley Project at the Tracy, what is now Jones Pumping Plant in the South Delta. And then, of course, all of the network of levees in the Delta that are protecting very productive agricultural activities in the Delta itself. And the other aspect that's important to acknowledge here is the land subsidence that has occurred over time in the Delta. Much of the Delta is below sea level, and up to 25 feet of subsidence. And the land subsidence occurring over time based on the degradation of the peat soils within the islands, and through microbial oxidation, wind erosion, compaction type activities at the present time. So next I'm going to cover here is delta hydrodynamics. Of course, this is by definition, an estuary is where the freshwater riverine environment meets the tidal environment, more saline type environment. So, we have most of our good quality freshwater inflow is from the Sacramento River, about 80% of that. Roughly about 15% of the inflow is coming from the less good quality San Joaquin River, and then good water quality coming from the east side streams, but less than about 5%. And so that would be the Cosumnes, McCollum, and Calaveras, the dominant east side rivers there. And then of course, there is the tidal flux of the ocean salinity coming in, since the channels are essentially at sea level. And of course, the delta is three-dimensional. So there is a tidal prism, with the fact that the salt water is denser than the freshwater, creates a wedge and intrudes beneath the freshwater in the delta channels. And it does create the gravitational and estuarian vertical mixing that occurs as a result of the tidal action coming into the estuary. And that tidal action, the tidal prism as measured at Martinez, again at kind of the mouth of the delta at the Cardenas Straits, that tidal prism varies by up to 5 feet twice per day. So that's a huge volume of water that is moving in and out of the delta on a daily basis. So this is the, as that tide increases, the stage level increases, salinity water is drawn into the channels of the delta on what's called the flood tide. And the reverse happens 6 or so hours later, when the stage reduces as part of that tide, saline water moves back out on the ebb tide. And just to give a feel for the magnitude of these tidal flux, as measured in Sassoon Bay, that's close to 330,000 CFS on the flood tide, a little bit greater on the on the ebb tide. That effect is somewhat attenuated as you go further deeper into the delta, but even at the city of Stockton, we see tidal flux of and reverse flows on those channels. And in contrast, during the summer period, when we're meeting operating to outflow standards, you typically would see outflows that could be as little as 1/100th of the total flux flow that's occurring through the tidal action. So the other cycle that's occurring, secondary tidal cycle, is the monthly time scale is the spring neap tide that varies with the orbit of the moon around the Earth once per month. So we get more energetic spring tides when there is alignment between the sun, the Earth, and the moon. That exacerbates the magnitude of the tides, and overall the average tides increase, and therefore they bring in more salt during these spring tide periods. The neap tides, when the moon and the sun are perpendicular to one another, that effect is dampened, and we tend to see less energetic tides and less concern about salinity intrusion during those periods. So when there is the salinity intrusion, it requires additional fresh water to prevent the salt from pushing too far into the delta. Other than the astronomical tides, there is also the effects of weather and the meteorological effects. So, for example, a storm surge associated with a storm and a low pressure system, onshore winds, that can have the same sort of impact as a spring tide, even if we're in a neap tide period. So meteorological effects can be very significant. And of course, if those would coincide during a spring tide, they would be doubly impactful in terms of the intrusion level that we would expect to see. So, one thing to note here is, especially in the first storms of the year before they really produce a lot of runoff, the first storms that we see in the late fall and the early winter actually worsen the water quality, much so before they would eventually get better from actual runoff that is produced by a series of storms. So that takes me to how do the projects manage those salinity conditions? So taking a step back, I think it's first good to understand how is it that the projects develop their water supply. So this yield is development occurs primarily in the winter and spring periods when there is excess direct runoff from rains and snowmelt. That excess inflow not needed for downstream diversions or delta standards is stored, in the case of State Water Project, in Lake Oroville. In the case of the Central Valley Project, primarily Shasta Reservoir and Lake Folsom. But it's important to note that there's also a significant amount of runoff that occurs from rain in the valley floor. And the excess flows associated with those rain events are picked up at the two project locations in the South Delta and stored in South San Luis Reservoir, which is south of Delta Reservoir. So unfortunately, the timing of the period when the projects are developing their water supply does not correspond when the water is most needed during the irrigation season, during the warm summers for urban use. So in the summer and fall period, that previously stored water is released for delivery. So in the case of the State Water Project, the previously stored water from Lake Oroville is released first to freshen the delta, ensure that we're meeting the standards. And then if there's additional stored water, that stored water can be rediverted at Banks Pumping Plant. And the same goes for the previously stored water in San Luis Reservoir south of the Delta is also released to supplement those bank exports at that time. So here's a graphical representation of the altered river hydrograph created by the project operations. Again, during the winter and spring, the inflows as depicted in blue on this graph are typically greater than what is needed to meet downstream needs. And those releases are shown in the red line. So this, there's typically plenty of additional flows from the valley rains that are meeting all of any diversion requirements or Bay Delta standards. So that excess water can be diverted to storage. And so the storage line is shown here in the dashed green. And that reverses as we get into the summer and fall, when the downstream needs become greater than as the inflows drop off after the snow melt. Then the process reverses, and the projects are releasing previously stored water to meet those legal diversions of water and the Delta standards, and additional water for export to the project water supply contractors. And this typically will continue until we get substantial precipitation in the late fall or winter period, and then the whole process will begin again. So Another important feature here is what is the path of that fresh water that is released in the summer for rediversion, excuse me, at the project pumping plants. And there's really two primary paths here. There's the releases down the Sacramento River. There's a key facility here, the Delta Cross Channel, which I'm going to talk about some more as well, is a key feature. Of course, there is a gate on that, typically open in the summertime. And the first path is essentially from the Sacramento River through the Delta Cross Channel to the McCullough River, and then connecting with Old and Middle River, which are two distributaries of the San Joaquin River in the more in the southern part of the Delta. And that directs the fresh water then is exported at the SWP and CVP pumps. The secondary path, which will occur for a couple reasons. One is if the pumping that's occurring at the project pumps exceeds the carrying capacity here of the cross channel, or if the cross channel gate is closed, fresh water will move further down the Sacramento River towards the confluence and then reverse back up the San Joaquin River into the interior of their delta and then down the Old and Middle River corridor. Now, on this second path, what will happen is the water will be more saline because there's a lot more mixing here in the confluence area between the San Joaquin and Sacramento. So the water is a bit more saline as it comes to the south. So this highlights the need. I think many of you have heard the term carriage water. So the purpose of the carriage water is to mitigate for this effect of the more saline water that is being brought into the interior delta by an incremental increase in delta pumping. There's additional freshwater flows that are needed to kind of dilute the effect of this more saline type effect of that alternative path to the project exports. Just to highlight more about this, essentially this regime that is set up in terms of the freshwater corridor, if we take a look at the maximum salinity intrusion that has occurred before and after the construction of the upstream project reservoirs, you can see that although there was fresher water in the spring period without the reservoirs, the extent of salinity intrusion would be much greater as we got towards the end of the summer and into the fall. And so that's depicted by the lines here. After the projects, you can see that there is a constant management and limitation of that saltwater intrusion. This corridor that I just showed earlier of fresh water is opened up for the ability for the projects to have a constant supply of fresh water to export. And we're also on the hook for meeting the salinity standards that are for beneficial uses in the interior of the delta as well through the entire year. And so what are these delta standards that I keep referring to? Of course, these would be most recent D1641 Bay Delta standards that are really in two large categories, flow operational and water quality. The flow and operational are primarily for fish and wildlife purposes. And some of those put limitations on the export capability. They also require delta outflow, Rio Vista flows, the spring X2 requirement that many of you have probably heard about is a big part of that in this. And as far as the water quality standards, they're really for three different purposes, for M&I, for agricultural, and fish and wildlife. So for the M&I, it's for all of the export locations within the Delta, including diversions to Contra Costa. Agricultural, there are various locations, both in the western interior delta and the south delta. And for fish and wildlife, the water quality standards primarily here in Sassoon Marsh. And these standards vary. They vary by month and they vary by year type. So depending on whether it's critical, dry, below normal, above normal, or wet, the magnitude of the requirement will vary. I think it's safe to say that the standards that apply in the winter and spring months, what those effectively do is limit the amount of stored water that the projects are allowed to divert. And then the standards that are met in the summer and the fall will be utilizing that previously stored water to meet those standards. So how do the projects operate to these standards? Well, fortunately, in real time, we have a terrific telemetered network of sensors, both salinity and flow, scattered throughout the delta. And so that gives us a real-time picture of how conditions are setting up and where we need to make adjustments to the system in order to meet the delta standards. So the projects have three primary knobs, if you will, to turn in order to meet these standards. First is the releases of that previously stored water from the upstream reservoirs. The second is the delta cross channel, which I've already discussed in quite a bit of detail. And the third is the export locations themselves. Though one of the big challenges for the release of stored water from upstream is the travel time that is required. So, for example, from Lake Folsom, the closest reservoir to the delta, a little less than a day is the time it takes for a release to make it as inflow to the delta. For Lake Oroville, it's 3 days. For Shasta, it's 5 days. And there's quite a bit of uncertainty in terms of the amount of water that's released and how much water actually shows up as inflow to the delta. There are hundreds of diversion points along the rivers. And so this takes a lot of planning, a lot of forecasting capability in order to know, up to 5, 6, 7 for power scheduling days in advance, what types of releases are needed to meet those standards. As far as the exports are concerned, there's pretty much an immediate response to the delta outflow and therefore the salinity conditions if we can modulate the export rates. One of the challenges, especially in drier years like this year and the last couple of years, because the export rates are so low, that tool is very limited. So when we're already near minimum export levels, there's not much export to drop in order to effectuate a rapid change in delta outflow. And so we have very limited ability to respond to big tidal changes or big changes in diversions that may be occurring on the rivers. And there are big changes typically right at the beginning of the irrigation season when everybody, all the diverters, the growers start up on the rivers, and when they shut off in the August period. So it's a really dynamic system, very difficult to operate to in terms of meeting those conditions with low exports. Some of the trade-offs, talked about the delta cross channel. It's very good for bringing good water quality into the interior and the South Delta. Unfortunately, it's in conflict with the migratory path for fish migration. So, in fact, the DCC gates are required to be closed from late fall through late spring for fishery migration purposes. So typically the what this represents is the most difficult time to meet salinity standards is in the late fall period. Just very briefly here on the other delta control structures that do exist in the delta. I've talked extensively about the delta cross channel. There's also the Montezuma Slough salinity control gates, which enabled the projects to meet the salinity standards in Sassoon Marsh. These radial gates are operated as a tidal pump, where the more freshwater ebb tides are allowed into the marsh and the more saline flood tides are kept out. So this keeps the salinity levels in the marsh fresher than what we would see in Sassoon Bay. Also of note, temporary barriers built on the middle river and old river distributaries of the San Joaquin River and Grant Line Canal. These are primarily, though, to mitigate for water levels in the South Delta because of the high pumping rates that can occur both at the state and federal facilities. There is some benefits to circulation in those channels, but these are always a challenge. These particular standards, they're not in line with the kind of the freshwater corridor that I had mentioned earlier, relies more heavily on the flows on the San Joaquin River. So recent droughts, we've seen in the last few years, record-breaking type events consistently. Been a year of extremes. Water year 2021 was the third driest on record, and you can see it's kind of in the same grouping as some of the other outlier years, such as 1977, 1924. By the way, this is for the Northern Sierra 8 station. Embedded within the 2021 was the driest and warmest April through September period that we've ever experienced. So much drier and warmer than even the 77 and the 24. The other really important factor that's come into play in the last several years is, even though it's been dry years, they've been exceptionally dry years for the Shasta Basin. And Lake Shasta watershed is seeing a record now for the last 3 years. This is the absolute driest 3-year period that for runoff that has been experienced at Lake Shasta. Lake Shasta is really important for that salinity control of it's the largest of the project reservoirs, and so hugely important. And then, of course, this last year, much noted, we started out with a bang with the so-called bomb cyclone and the associated atmospheric river that produced record-breaking October precip. But things really fizzled out beginning in January, and as is much publicized, we've just experienced the driest January through March period on record in over 100 years of record. And far, half of what the previous outlier year was, which was recently 2013. And what's of note is, 3 of the driest 5 years on record have been within the last decade. So the current drought has caused a number of actions on the part of the projects. One, of course, is the temporary urgency change petitions, both last year and this year, for some relief on some of the standards in the Delta because of the lack of storage to create that hydraulic barrier for salinity intrusion. So the other thing that has taken place is the construction of a physical salinity barrier at West Falls River. And so that's currently installed. It was installed last year, was notched over the winter. That notch has been filled, and it is still in place for this coming year. Also, we're looking at, in a planning looking at the possibility of additional barrier locations at Minor Slough and Steamboat Slough in the north part of the Delta. We're looking at this as a contingency for even drier conditions than what we've seen this year. So changing climate. To start with, I think it's good to review the fact that California has the most varied annual precipitation of any state in the entire country. And that's what makes water management such a challenge in the state. As depicted here, we're really dependent on just a handful of storms every year to produce our water supply. As the graphic here shows, 10 to 15 days a year is where we get half of our water supply for the entire year. So it's a really hit or miss type of hydrology. So here's an example of where temperature and precipitation have been observed over the last 100+ years. There's groupings of 30 years here. So the kind of the black or dark green diamonds here, these are observations of, on the y-axis, precipitation, on the x-axis, temperature. And you can see the scatter, the variation for, these are 30 years from the late 19th century, early 20th century. The large black diamond is the average. Here's another grouping. Orange circles here represent kind of the second half of the 20th century individual years, and then the average is the large circle. And then the most recent 30-year period is depicted in the blue squares, with the large blue square being the average of all of those 30 years. And so what's really readily apparent is, although the average precipitation hasn't really changed, there is a clear signal towards warmer conditions and perhaps greater variation. So what is the effect of all this? Altered hydrologic patterns, lower snowpack, higher losses associated with evaporative forces, and lower natural flows later in the year. Here's the observations of the snowpack. Very clear trend line shows decreasing snowpack over time since this particular graph since 1950. And of course, notably, the very low snowpack years, 14, 15 year without a snowpack essentially, and last few years very low as well. Those low snowpack have also altered the hydrologic pattern, where much lower flows now in the spring and summer period. So this graph depicts the April through July runoff as a percentage of the total water year, and you can also see the downward trend. This is a phenomenon, this graph put together, one of many here by Dr. Anderson, state climatologist. This is depicting what used to be exceptional is now becoming the rule. And for this particular parameter, we're looking at minimum temperatures, but there are many other hydrologic parameters that this model fits for. As you can see, it was exceptional that a certain threshold temperature might have been met earlier in the decade. More recent years, it's become more common. And now we're at the point where it would be the exception if the temperature were lower than that threshold.
John, you've got about 1 more minute. Can you go to your conclusion?
All right, thank you. So sea level rise is the other major driver for hydrodynamics here. There has been an increase of 0.8 inches since 1900. And that's only expected to accelerate as we go into the coming century. And of course, what is the relevance of that sea level rise on the salinity? The increasing hydrostatic pressure from the bay will push salinity deeper into the delta, and this will increase the need for volumes of fresh water to repel that salt water. So I just have a couple more slides here with a few thoughts, food for thought, perhaps teeing up some of the discussions in the panels later. But yes, we're seeing a changing climate that is affecting us now. The historical relationships are breaking down. The 1415 was not a once in a lifetime, once in a generation type event. Here we are 6 years later, and we're experiencing something very similar. Even within the year, we're seeing this weather whiplash. Wet and dry streaks are becoming longer in duration, more intense, more frequent. The warming conditions are reducing that snowpack and reducing the melt efficiency through losses. Last slide. So what do we expect for the future? We know we need to invest and improve our forecasting capability. Since those historical relationships are breaking down, we need to go to a more physically based approach. We should expect water supply yields are going to decrease due to these adverse effects that in the hydrologic cycle. We will become more reliant on the physical salinity barriers. We're taking more of a programmatic approach because we do see that there is going to be the need to more frequently install these rock barriers to supplement the hydraulic barrier. And then physical infrastructure improvements, a number of projects in the works, and really the fundamental aspect behind these projects is to capture more supply during wet periods and improve the reliability during the drier periods. So that completes my presentation here. Hopefully this is at least laid out some kind of fundamentals on the salinity management and helps tee up some of those ongoing discussions for the panels over today and tomorrow. So thank you.
Thank you so much, John. I do think that laid a good foundation for us to build upon, and that we don't have time for questions right now. I will mention that John is a part of our 11 o'clock panel discussion. And so there will be an opportunity, if you have questions, please jot them down, and you're welcome to put them in the chat during that panel discussion, and we can see if we can direct them to John during that portion of the agenda. So thanks, John, for now, and I'll see you again in an hour or so. In the meantime, we're going to pivot to our social dimensions panel, and we're just gonna take a quick 2-minute break while we get our panelists ready for that panel. So if you're in the audience, I welcome you to get up and stretch and go get a glass of water or a cup of coffee, and we'll be back at 10 a.m. So just in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
Hi, Bill.
Okay, good morning, everyone.
Good morning, Michelle. This is Steve Mello. I'm in.
Thanks, Steve. And I'm going to open up this panel. My name is Michelle Leinfelder-Miles, and I'm the Delta Crops Advisor with the University of California Cooperative Extension. In my role as a farm advisor, I do research and outreach to the agricultural and resource management communities in the Delta. I have served on the workshop planning committee because part of my research program has involved studying how surface water salinity affects soil salinity in the Delta. It is my pleasure to serve as the moderator of this panel discussion, The Social Dimensions of Salinity in the Delta. Our panelists have intimate knowledge and experiences on this topic because they live, work, and recreate in the Delta. We will discuss how salinity impacts human livelihoods, health, recreation, equity, and community organizing. Since this is the first panel of the workshop, I want to start by setting some expectations for the audience. These are large panels and we value all panelists' perspectives, but there will not be time for every panelist to respond to every question. Audience members will not be able to unmute or contribute verbally, but both panelists and audience members are encouraged to contribute to the conversation using the chat. Questions for the panel have been prepared in advance by the Workshop Planning Committee, and the discussion will largely center on those. However, the chat will be monitored, and if there's time, key questions or talking points will be directed to the panel. So with that, I'd like to introduce our panelists, and after my brief introductions, they will each be able to introduce themselves in their own words. Barbara Berrigan-Perea is the Executive Director of Restore the Delta. Lenora Clark is the Staff Commodore of the Pacific Interclub Yacht Association and Director and past President of the Recreational Boaters of California. Captain Jim Cox is the President of the State Board of the California Striped Bass Association. Steve Mello is the President of Mello Farms and Mello Lock Ranch. He's also the President of Reclamation District 563 and the Chairman of the North Delta Water Agency Board of Directors. Ivan Seenock is the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer and Cultural Resource Director of the Buena Vista Rancheria of the Miwok Indians. And last but not least, Bill Wells is the Executive Director of the California Delta Chambers and Visitors Bureau. Thank you all for being with us today and joining on this panel. Now I'd like to invite each of you to take a couple of minutes to describe your background and professional experiences to set the stage for our panel. I'd like to start with Barbara.
Good morning, everyone, and thanks for the help with the technical difficulty. We've registered a lot of people at the same time. I'm Barbara Berrigan-Perea, and I'm co-founder and executive director of Restore the Delta. We have been organizing on Delta issues for 16 years. And over the last 8 years, we have written extensively in legal testimony, reports, and comment letters on the socioeconomic makeup of the Delta. I have co-authored 2 reports related to today's topic, one entitled The Fate of the Delta, and the other Climate Equity and Seismic Resiliency for the San Francisco Bay Delta Estuary. By training, I'm an English professor, published author, and editor. My colleague, Tim Stroshane, was trained as a city planner and environmental economist. And between the two of us, we have described the data and through storytelling, the makeup of Delta communities. And we have been able to write extensively about the science connected to salinity. Presently, I have been able to formulate a harmful algal bloom research program with a tremendous amount of assistance from the California Water Boards, their scientists at SF Baykeeper, University of North Carolina, and Duke University. And our program is going to be run by a young scientist, Spencer Fern. We'll be tracking salinity and water temperature throughout this HAB season, along with cyanobacteria. And we're going to be sharing this data with agencies, government agencies, and making our findings available to the general public as well.
Thank you, Barbara. Next, we'll go to Lenora.
Good morning, and I appreciate the opportunity to not only sit on the panel, but to hear the overview of plans and things that have gone on in the Delta. I joined the panel as a layperson. I'm a retired postal executive. I spent 2 terms on the Boating and Waterways Commission and 2 opportunities to preside as president over that commission. I've also sat on the Boat US National Advisory Council, which focuses on federal advocacy for boating and boaters. I have been the director and president of Recreational Boating and Fishing Foundation, which is under the auspices of the Department of Interior. I am presently past president and director on the board of directors for Recreational Boaters of California, which is a statewide advocacy organization. And we speak with both legislators and regulators on bills and issues that affect water and our ability to boat throughout California. I was the Commodore and president of Pacific Interclub Yacht Association, which is over 100 years old, and in Northern California has membership of 108 yacht clubs, and there are 90 similarly situated yacht clubs in Southern California that we represent. I'm presently staff Commodore of Pacific Interclub Yacht Association and lead their past presidents roundtable. But I come to you locally as a resident of Discovery Bay, an avid boater for, I'm not going to tell you how many decades. I sat on the advisory commission for Frank's Track Futures. I'm vice president of the Save the Delta Alliance, which is made up of Delta people and businesses. I'm currently working on the Boating and Waterways Stakeholder Committee, and we're looking at the proper use of boaters' funds and fees that are collected from boaters for programs and projects that will benefit our recreation. I'm also on the Sacramento San Joaquin National Heritage Association, which is focusing on our Delta as a global entity and something that is recognized not only in California, throughout the United States, but around the world. And as was already mentioned, it's the largest estuary in the Northern Americas. And I am most concerned that whatever actions are taken do not have unintended consequences that will adversely affect this Delta and our ability to recreate in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenora. Next, we'll go to Jim.
Hello, I'm Captain Jim Cox. I'm state board president of the California Striped Bass Association, and I am a retired charter boat captain. Professionally fished the waters of the Delta and the Bay for over 23 years. I'm a native San Franciscan, third generation. I grew up on the peninsula. I fished off the bank from about 10 years old on. I've been both recreational and commercial fisherman. I became involved with the California Striped Bass Association in about 1980, and through the years have been chapter president and held various offices through it. And I just like to say about the Striped Bass Association that I learned a whole lot of what I know about fishing from the senior guys that were in the club when I joined. And the thing that they taught me was that fishing is a lot more than just lures, hooks, and baits. It's also making sure that there are fish for future generations. As long as I've been a member of the Striped Bass Association, that's been our goal, been my own goal. And whenever there's an issue at Fish and Game that involves the fisheries of the Delta or the Bay, you will find California Striped Bass Association members there. I'm also a member of the Delta Protection Advisory Committee. Like Laura, I'm on the advisory committee for the Frank's Track Futures Project. And I also was a member of the SEC, the Stakeholders Engagement Committee for the single pipeline project. So that's pretty much my background.
Thank you, Jim. And next in our introductions, we'll go to Steve. Steve, perhaps you could turn your camera on too when you're chatting with us.
I just did.
Thank you.
And thank you for my fellow panelists and for having the opportunity to address the public here. In addition to being president of Mellow Farms and Mellow Lock Ranch, the Reclamation District 563 that protects Tyler Island, I am currently the chairman of the North Delta Water Agency. I've been a director since 2001. Prior to that, I represented the North Delta Water Agency at the Delta Protection Commission from 1993 through 01. To give you an idea of my personal bent, we have conducted wildlife friendly farming practices on our island, Tyler Island, since before Steve. And I have, and my son has continued that. I helped to form the North Delta Conservancy, a 501c3 in the North Delta area with the goal of preserving farmland for production and give a critical mass of acres to our farm support industry. Helped to form the local Delta Ducks Unlimited chapter. I was a longtime board member, 20 years plus, on the Central Valley Flood Control Association. And we formed, my son and I and my wife formed another farming company, J&L Mellow Farm Equipment Company, of which I'm managing partner. So I'm busy, but you need to stay busy to protect your livelihood. Water is the key to it. So I've been very involved with water, and flood control is essential as well. So I've been very involved there. Thank you much.
Thanks, Steve. Next, we'll go to Ivan.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be on here. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. My name is Ivan Seanock. I am the TIPO and Cultural Resource Director for the Buena Vista Rancheria of Miwok Indians. About myself personally, I have several degrees in anthropology, all stemming from work with Indigenous communities. I serve as a representative for the Buena Vista Rancheria of Miwok Indians, and it's an honor to be in front of everybody today. I've worked on Indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, cultural monitoring, cultural resource protection for the past 6 years, stemming from Northern California all the way down here to the Delta, working with Yokuts and other traditional groups. I serve as not only as a cultural resource director for the Buena Vista Rancheria of Miwok Indians, I'm also a tribal advisor for several Shasta groups seeking federal recognition and protection of their cultural and ecological resources. The Delta, in a longer view beyond my very short tenure, barely reaching 10 years here, is been an indigenous place for thousands of years. Everybody here has spoken of several generations, and I represent and work with people who have been here for 10, 15, 20 generations who actively work to protect and restore the Delta. The Delta has changed over many years, since Spanish missions to the United States, the gold rush, and coming into the present day. This kind of change is not disregarded, but it is known. We seek to restore and have an adaptive, resilient climate for everybody who lives here, every fisherman, every person engaged in the Delta, and every business who is there. Many of the traditional gathering plots have not been restored, they have not been maintained, but smaller ones have been popping up everywhere. This is the kind of work I'm involved with daily. We do tule beds, we do cultural burns, we do regulation meetings, as well as support local assembly bills that protect and manage the Delta for everyone. It's a pleasure to speak to everybody today, and I look forward to the discussions coming from this panel.
Thank you, Ivan. And then lastly, we'll have Bill Wells.
Thank you, Michelle. Good morning, everybody. Bill Wells, I'm currently the Executive Director of the California Delta Chambers and Visitors Bureau. I'm a lifelong boater for many, many decades. I'll challenge Lenora Clark to see if she has more decades than me, but that'll be a side discussion. Anyway, I've got 29 current years of boating in the Delta, and I've cruised all the way from San Francisco Bay to Stockton and Sacramento. I was a former marine surveyor, and I'm a retired yacht broker, so I've had a lot of firsthand experience of the effects of salt on boats and marine structures. I've spent two years on the BDCP, if you remember that. We call it the Bay Delta Canal Plan that Jerry Brown implemented a while back. So I was on that panel, and I was also spent 2 years on the Delta Protection Commission Advisory Committee. So I feel I've got quite a bit of current experience. And by the way, I'm the receptionist for the California Delta Chambers too. So I get all the calls from people lost out in the Delta and when their boats break down. So again, I've got quite a bit of firsthand experience. Anyway, thank you. I'm honored to be on the panel today.
Thank you, Bill. And just a reminder for our panelists, if you want to stay on camera, please do. Maybe go on mute when you're not speaking, just to prevent any background noise. Or if you're in a quiet space, it's fine to stay unmuted too. But next, I'll invite our panelists to take a couple of minutes to address how salinity and salinity management affect people's livelihoods and well-being in the Delta. I'm going to invite Ivan to start, and then we'll go through a list of folks. Jim and Steve are going to reserve their comments till the end of our group, and that is because I'm going to tag on a little bit to their question. So first, Ivan.
Thank you, Michelle. So salinity management for indigenous peoples in the Delta have been shaped over the decades of colonization, but have also bring benefits to their current gathering strategies. Salinity played a key role in growth management, use, and connections to the Delta. Like everybody here who has spoken to me previously, and I'm sure as well as many of the people that are tuning into this panel, the relationship with the Delta truly is a give and take. The salinity has affected, especially with droughts, not only access to food, it has access to gathering locations as well as harmful algae blooms. So this really comes into where management and protection of the Delta, which is a critical resource for everybody on this panel, everybody living in this area, truly needs to come in. Some of the materials I've harvested with elders include tules, mussels, clams, buckeyes, and oaks, and anything that comes from the marshlands. Traditionally, over 500 species. I have a list that I grab and go out with these elders to gather on a seasonal basis, and at certain times of the year are all affected by salinity. So these salinity management kind of has had a massive impact, no matter on what fisheries we're using, what kind of gathering plots we're going through, and what kind of other ceremonies that engage with the Delta. The Delta is truly unique because not only it's the largest Delta, but it also is the crossroads near Mount Diablo. Everybody who's been there has seen Mount Diablo from the beautiful waters, and that area is a ceremonial site and a sacred site for most of the Miwoks, Yokuts, and Ohlone and Custodians. And those are just very names, but truly represents many peoples. Traditionally, before any Europeans came to California, there was a village every 5 to 10 miles, and the salinity marshes and the marshes that flowed from the Sutter Buttes all the way down to Tulare Lake prior to the Spanish coming supported this habitat. So not only does me going out there gathering with those elders truly link into the salinity, but that social salinity really affects into the gathering and a connection to those ancestors and ancestral places.
Thank you, Ivan. Next, we'll go to Barbara.
Thank you. And Ivan really summed up a lot of points that we've kind of just touched on briefly in our work. Salinity management and climate change impacts, for better or worse, are going to touch every aspect of people's lives in the 5 Delta counties. Government agencies tend to think of the area as the interior Delta, but the secondary zones of the 5 Delta counties and entire Delta County populations are tied to freshwater economies and drinking water supplies. Rural and urban Delta communities rise and fall together. Salinity will have impacts on cultural resources for the tribes that are connected to the Delta. Salinity will impact 72 small drinking water systems located in the Delta. A good percentage of those impact directly environmental, are used by environmental justice subcommunities, small areas. Municipal drinking water systems will be impacted, farm irrigation systems, farm water, farm economies, related farm service and food processing economies, recreation economies, boating, and subsistence fisheries. We have about 40,000 people who depend on fish in the Delta for their basic diet. All will be impacted physically and economically. Also, infrastructure we don't think about is going to have costs associated with it that are going to impact the counties and the entire state. The gas industry, the electricity industry, railroads, highway maintenance, sewage treatment will all be impacted and result in higher user costs and will require rebuilt systems and infrastructure. You know, when we think about salinity and the discussion of salt water, you can't completely separate it from impacts from sea level rise, and sea level rise in terms of impacts on infrastructure that will touch all of our lives could include damage to land subsidence, degradation of underground utilities, saltwater intrusion into groundwater, and sewage overflow, inundation of low-lying treatment facilities. Economic impacts are tremendous on the lives of the 4 million people in the 5 Delta counties, and we think have really been tremendously underestimated. For years, we have been looking for a socioeconomic cost-benefit analysis of the value of fresh water to the 5 Delta counties and to all of California. We do have fear because if we do not manage the changes that are coming because of climate change, if we don't manage it properly, there's going to be great environmental, cultural, and economic disasters pending for the Delta.
Thank you, Barbara. Bill.
Okay. Hope you can't hear that in the background. The water company's out there doing something. But anyway, the salt water is about 5 times more corrosive than fresh water on metal parts. So going back to my days as a marine surveyor, there's a lot of potential for damage to boats that spend a lot of time in salt water. And as the water intrudes further into the Delta, the more it's going to affect. The same with dock structures, the metal parts and docks. So it's going to be a lot more wear and tear on boats and docks and even bridges and municipal structures. Regarding water intakes, Antioch has a water intake, and they've at times had to shut it down while the pumps in the South Delta were drawing so much water out, drawing the salt water up into the Antioch area. I hear now they're building a desal plant, so again, that's a huge impact on them. This morning, I spoke to my good friend Chris Lawrenson, who owns the Lawrenson Yacht Harbor right at the base of the Antioch Bridge. He says he hasn't seen any damage to his own structures, but he said the fishermen launched there are constantly talking about how they can actually taste the salt water nowadays. So it's a big impact. The other thing is there's appears to be a lot more pelagic species coming into the Delta. I've personally seen jellyfish down in the Bethel Island area. The reports of sharks, I haven't seen one personally, but I've seen photographs of them, leopard sharks. And the whole Delta seems to be taken over by sea lions over the last 10 years or so. And they extend as far up to the confluence of the American River and Sacramento River. They're into downtown Stockton. If you cruise by the port of Stockton at night, you can hear them barking under the under the dock structures all the time. In fact, if in some of the neighborhoods in Stockton, you can hear them barking. So it is a large impact on boating and the pleasure use of water. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. And then Lenora.
Thank you. I'm in Discovery Bay, and we have the sea lions out in our bays, which is something that we didn't have 20, 30 years ago. But as far as salinity management in the Delta, I just want to reiterate the fact that recreational boating in California is a $13 billion a year business. There are 41,125 jobs supported by boating, recreational boating, and 2,820 small businesses that are supported by recreational boating. And when we look at salinity management, we're looking at the barriers and the gates that impede our ability to navigate the waters that are supposed to be there and available for us to navigate. So not only is boating affected, but all the businesses that surround boating, all the businesses throughout the Delta, boat works, restaurants, and recreational areas. And it also affects the property values in the Delta when we get additional salt water, when we have the algae blooms, the invasive species, and all those things that come along with it. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenora. Steve and Jim will be addressing this question next, and I've asked them to not only address salinity impacts in general, as the other panelists have done, but also on how these impacts are accentuated during drought or under conditions expected with climate change. So Steve, why don't I hand it over to you, because you're getting a doubled up question. We'll give you a little bit extra time to talk.
Thank you. Maybe a surprise to some, but high salinity levels have not yet impacted livelihoods or well-being within the North Delta Water Agency due to our 1981 contract with Department of Water Resources that stipulates water quality at 7 different designated locations in the Delta and has other provisions in the contract regarding reverse flows and stage. The one thing that I was going to lead off with, and I forgot, is that I want to have a couple of corrections on page 5 of 9. The North Delta Water North Delta Water Agency contract. It says that in the Delta Stewardship Council's missive that the North Delta Water Agency contract is not in effect during critically dry years, and that is not the case. It is in effect. The standards change depending upon the water year type. And if there is harm to users in the North Delta Water Agency, there's a payment provision in it. And also on page 597B, the Delta Cross Channel is not operated as a flood control facility. It is mandated to stay closed during those times. Sorry for getting off track. But at any rate, the high salinity levels have not yet impacted us in the North Delta Water Agency. May in the future, we don't know. I would like to reiterate what Barbara said about a brackish delta resulting from sea level rise would reduce or ruin the water quality and aquifers used by Delta residents and the residents of cities and unincorporated towns in the statutory Delta. It would also negatively impact groundwater supplies that provide for municipal industrial use in cities on the periphery of the Delta. Very big, broad spread impacts of the presence of water high in salinity that is unsuitable for irrigation in the Delta would occur. Economic losses to growers would have negative socioeconomic impacts to the farm support industry, as well as all ancillary businesses that rely in part on patronage from farms, farm workers, and farm support personnel. Loss of jobs in the areas impacted would impact the curriculums in local schools for the remaining students, as enrollments would decline when displaced workers move to find new jobs. Their kids go with them. The loss of federal per diem per day would be devastating in local schools. Reduction of system reliability that benefits water transfer for export and flood control would result from economic losses to landowners who pay reclamation district assessments that pay for the levee maintenance and improvement. The farmers and landowners are the geese that lay the golden eggs that maintain the Delta levees, with help from the Delta Levee Subventions Program, but the majority of the money comes from local landowners. Negative environmental impact from the inability of farmers to have fresh water who flood harvested fields of coarse and cereal grains to benefit migratory waterfowl, including endangered species such as the greater sandhill crane. And those wildlife-friendly farming practices that entail flooding also reduce carbon emissions from because that flooding reduces tractor passes. It reduces chemical use because the flooding reduces the necessity to spray as often or as much. Would result in higher oxidation levels of soils high in organic matter because flooding reduces or eliminates aerobic activity in the soil. And basically, we also provide a heck of a moisture base for the spring and summer crops by flooding in the winter, during which there is net delta water outflow to the bay that is excess of that mandated by law. So that reduces our spring use and early summer irrigation. So the impacts of salinity in the Delta would be widespread, from even being able to live there to be able to provide the economic activity to sustain the local economy and communities, the profits to maintain the levees and thereby contribute to system reliability, and as I alluded to provide for water transfer and flood control. So thank you.
Thank you, Steve. And Jim?
Hello. Okay, I will be speaking about the effects of saltwater intrusion on the fisheries of the Delta and the livelihoods of those who rely on those fisheries. To understand the effects of saltwater intrusion, you must understand the species involved. The Delta has two types of fish: freshwater fish, such as largemouth bass, bluegills, and catfish. Saltwater intrusion will affect these species by limiting and reducing the areas they can live in. The biggest effect would be on largemouth bass. We have a world-class bass fishery here, and national tournaments consistently catch the largest bass in the country out of the Delta. Saltwater will ruin this, along with the financial benefits of those tournaments, which adds up into the millions of dollars. The second type of fish are andronymous fish that move back and forth between fresh and saltwater, but spawn in freshwater. Saltwater intrusion has several effects on these species. Andronymous fish include salmon, steelhead, sturgeon, American shad, and striped bass. To understand how saltwater intrusion will affect these species depends on the needs of each species and the root cause of saltwater intrusion. Salmon are an example of the cause of saltwater intrusion is affecting these fish more than the intrusion itself. Saltwater intrusion has two causes. One is what I call big picture causes: climate change with sea level rise, less snowpacks, more precipitation in the form of rain, and hotter overall temperatures are all contributing to saltwater intrusion. Then there are causes that I call Delta specific. One of the biggest causes of saltwater intrusion is the enormous amount of water that is exported out of the Delta. Freshwater has historically held back the push of saltwater on the tides. As more and more water is exported out of the delta, the salt water pushes further east, and it is more than just the volume. It is the management of the system that is also affecting salmon. Poor water management that results in low and warm water conditions on the Sacramento River in late summer have nearly wiped out the salmon spawn, particularly over the last 2 years. So you can easily say that salmon suffer from the cause more than the effect. Striped bass are completely different and are suffering from the actual saltwater intrusion. For more than a century, the Sassoon Marshes served as a nursery for striped bass fry and to a certain extent salmon fry. This area was perfect as it was the brackish mix point. Striper fry would have salty water on incoming tides and fresh water on outgoing tides, just the way they will live the rest of their life, as well as providing cover in the shallow canals and sloughs out of the stronger tide flows of the main river. Saltwater intrusion has wiped out Sassoon Marshes as a nursery. Now that brackish water mix is along the main rivers with much bigger tide flows that put the fry at the mercy of the larger predators. The survival rate of striped bass fry has dropped significantly. So how do all these changes affect the livelihoods of the people involved in both recreational and commercial fishing? The horrible salmon spawns and the resulting drop of numbers in the ocean have put many commercial salmon boats out of business, and many are barely hanging on. This shows how saltwater intrusion has bad effects even miles away from the delta. The drop in fish numbers in the delta has put many of the delta's long-time fishing guides out of business. The Delta Protection Commission's economic report shows the decline in boating and recreation in the delta. We have lost marinas and the related jobs. The striped bass and salmon have declined, so has the party boat fleet on the bay. More loss of jobs. The water management procedures of DWR have exacerbated the effects of climate change. The volume of water exported just does not leave enough flow out to the bay to hold back salt water. The particularly frustrating aspect of this situation is that if it wasn't for the enormous amount of water being exported, I do not think we would even be having this discussion.
Thank you, Jim. Our next question is for Bill. Bill, do we have the tools to quantify the effects of salinity on people's work, health, or recreation?
Well, the short answer is sort of. Number one, the last several decades, they've been monitoring what they call the X2 point, and it's approximately offshore from Roe Island down in the Antioch, Pittsburgh area. So they monitor that and try to maintain it. One of the problems is they just recently they decided that, in going back to Jim's point about the water exports, they've built a barrier across False River, and it's supposed to be taken out in November, but I'm hearing rumors that they're not going to take it out. Well, that prevents the salt water from intruding into the Bethel Island, Frank's Tract, Discovery Bay area. But also it serves as a sacrificial to allow the salt to build up more in the Antioch area. So even though you've got in place a barrier to prevent the salt, going back to if the flow of the water coming out of the delta was proper to begin with, it would never need anything like that. I'm hearing rumors that they're going to be installing one up on Minor Slough, which they talked about before. So again, the answer is there are tools available. Are we using them properly? No, and that's been the story of the Department of Water Resources ever since I've been in the Delta. Thank you. Lenora, did you have a question?
I didn't have a question. I had a comment piggybacking on what Bill is alluding to. When we look as boaters, when we look at the gates and the other kinds of tools that you're calling them to affect salinity, some of those gates become hazards to navigation because of the increased turbidity that it creates with the water going around those gates. So there's a safety issue involved in that also.
Right, very true. Yeah, that's with the barrier and False River. I've heard anecdotal stories of boats getting almost trapped in the water flows there. So again, you get into the law of unintended consequences whenever we do something. So if we would increase the flow of water through the delta like it used to be, then a lot of these problems would be eliminated.
Thank you to you both for
Thank you.
addressing that question. If I could reach out to the IT team, Barbara Berrigan-Pri is our next speaker, and she had a few slides that she wanted to share while she addressed the next question. So Barbara will address the environmental justice issues around delta salinity and which communities are most affected. Barbara.
Yeah, if we could flip to the second slide, that would be helpful. I just wanted to take a moment today to remind the audience what is environmental justice and how it relates to water. Of course, in California, we have the human right to water as codified law. We also work very hard at Restore the Delta to make that connection between the human right to water, our environmental justice communities in the region, and the connection to protecting public trust resources. We believe the more we do to protect our environmental justice populations, the more the protective benefits of good water quality and quantity will spread out to everyone associated with the 5 Delta counties and throughout the state. Next slide, please. The question today is if some communities are impacted more than others, and I would say you want to think of it more is what has happened throughout California and throughout the country in terms of COVID. Residents, both urban and rural, who come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds feel the economic impacts much harder and much sooner than middle class or more affluent people. Here are some of the parties who will be impacted immediately with greater salinity in the region, with sea level rise impacts. Over 50% of our North Delta towns speak Spanish as a primary language. They're part of an extensive farm worker community. We have 40,000 sustenance fishers in the Delta region. We have a farm worker community in the thousands that live in North Delta towns, but also live in urban areas in San Joaquin County and actually commute to work. We have 72 small drinking water systems in the interior Delta, and I don't believe there's been a great deal of mapping out or study on the impacts of salinity and sea level rise on those systems. We have major municipal water systems for Stockton, Antioch, and Contra Costa Water District, and there will be impacts on tribal cultural resources and freedom of religion practices for tribes that are connected to the estuary as well. Salinity and changes to delta water quality will have impact on all of our environmental justice communities and ultimately all of our people. Next slide, please. Stockton's an interesting case. It has the largest environmental justice population percentage-wise in California, 120,000 people alone, an unhoused population living along waterways in the thousands. Salinity would thwart economic redevelopment plans for this region. And at the same time, entire towns in the North Delta could be impacted by salinity problems, I think, if action isn't taken to protect as much of the estuary as possible. Last slide, please. I think the question is ultimately, sea level rise, climate change are given, extended drought, changes in the oceans. But the question is, are we going to manage the system to protect the region from salinity intrusion, the 4 million people who live here? It's not just a science outcome today. It's really a societal decision. And a failure to plan properly, broadly, and comprehensively will result in great climate injustice to the Delta's 4 million people, with environmental justice communities feeling the impacts first. And if not solved, it could be one of the greatest disasters of climate injustice, I think, in the United States.
Thank you, Barbara. We have one final question, and Lenora and Ivan will be addressing it. We'll start with Lenora. What community organizing is already being done around this issue of salinity, and who needs to be at the table?
Thank you, Michelle. As I mentioned in the intro, that I'm the Vice President of Save the Delta Alliance, and one of our other board members is also Bill Wells. And that alliance is made up of the actual people of the Delta, people who reside in the Delta, Discovery Bay, Bethel Island, and all points in the Delta, people who have small businesses in the Delta are involved in Save the Delta Alliance. And so we try to bring all of those different people with different ideas, with different perspectives together to organize and talk to our legislators, our regulators, people who are making the decisions that will ultimately affect us. One of the high points that I noticed in the Sacramento San Joaquin National Heritage Area is that we're bringing the tribal influence and the people who built the levees in the Delta together to talk about how those impacts will carry on from years going forward. We have farmers at the table. As James mentioned, we've got people that are with the fisheries and fishermen at the table. A lot of times as boaters, we include fishermen in our pulling together of and organizing of communities. Fishermen see themselves as fishermen. We see them as boaters also. So we have common interests and a common thread that we, like when we sat on the Frank Track's Futures Committee, we voted for, don't do anything to the Delta right now. Leave it the way it is. And why would you try to fix something that those of us in the Delta don't feel is broken? They were looking at different ways to do restoration, not taking into consideration that people that boat through Frank's Track is like Highway 880, and to put barriers and things down in Frank's Track is to create barriers to our navigation, is to create more opportunities for us to have to go around using more gas, which in effect would pollute the environment more. And so all these people need to be brought to the table, and we need to hear all of their input. So as I said, the best possible decisions can be made. And I continue to see the yin and yang between salinity and water conveyance. When you're trying to keep salt intrusion out, but you're lessening the natural flows of water to the bay, it's, they're almost diametrically opposed from what we as lay people see. And I hope that the scientists and the experts will take our concerns in mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Lenora. And Ivan.
Thank you, Michelle. tribes in the Delta, as was mentioned by Lenora and Barbara before me, are truly working in different formats to work with everyone to the table. I love that analogy, bring people to the table, because that's what I get yelled at by elders anytime that there's something that needs to be discussed, because everybody truly is involved. There is a common interest in the Delta, but there's also the common responsibility of boaters, of fishermen, of legislators here. Tribes work both formally and informally. As recognized tribes, I sit on the Delta Stewardship Council's many various parts. I work with them in consultations through regulations that were set up by the federal and state government. But also informally, tribes have family gathering spots, gathering locations. I also truly love the idea that rivers are highways. They were the original highways of California. How did the McCollum Miwoks get from Upper Amador County all the way to the sacred site of Mount Diablo? Thule boats were built and taken down through the Delta. So whenever somebody's driving a car and like, oh, this is a great little highway, I was like, just think how much better it is when you go through the rivers and the lakes and see the way it has been for thousands of years, not just 200 years. So boaters, I truly appreciate everyone because they understand and see the world as tribes see it sometimes. Basket weavers are basket weaving associations, use traditional fire practices. They manage grasslands and different areas within the Delta that have salinity benefits, but also community work. And one of those biggest things that I advocate for is bring everybody to the table again. Well, both federally recognized and unrecognized, the Delta is a really unique landscape. It truly crosses 5 or 6 traditional language groups, plus everybody else that lives at the Delta. And as was said before, it is a cultural resource, the entire Delta. It's not one local site, and I'm not just talking about like archaeological sites, but there is an actual relationship between people and the Delta. People are related to the trees there. People are related to the Thules and have a responsibility. And both these formal and informal groups of tribal members and tribal communities and tribal families are teaching the young ones, the little ones that are at our schools that will be adversely affected, that we have a responsibility to that water because the water is critical. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivan.
We finished a little early, huh?
Yeah, we did finish a little early. I want to, I'll reach out to co-organizers and they can help direct me if there are questions in the chat. But in the next minute, I just want to take a moment to sum up what I was hearing over the panel today. And I want to thank everybody on the panel for their contributions, the time that they took to prepare their remarks, and the time that they're taking to participate in this workshop today. They have given us insights on the social dimensions of salinity in the Delta, how it impacts individuals and their communities, how it impacts them now, and how it might be impacting them in the future. We heard recollections of history and thoughts toward the future. We heard remarks about culture and livelihoods and a sense of community. And that community, it sounds like it branches more than the immediate people that these people touch on their daily lives, but instead it's a community of people throughout the Delta, regardless of their job or their age or their background. It's a community of people in the Delta who participate in these organizations that work together. These boots on the ground insights are extremely valuable for salinity management and planning and development of modeling scenarios. So again, I want to thank you all for your time today. I don't think I'm seeing questions in the chat directed for the panel, but certainly there's some discussion that's been happening.
There is one item, Michelle, that I wish I could address for a second.
Oh, sure. Thanks. I'm in a
Okay.
midst of scroll here.
There's a question that was placed in there by Darcy Austin about environmental justice communities that are served by the State Water Project. And, you know, at Restore the Delta, we have written about those communities extensively, and we have partnered with them for years because it is true that the State Water Project provides water for a large section of California's environmental justice communities, but there are also concerns about best management practices for their own environmental justice water ratepayers, and about if water is actually reaching communities within their service areas that are dependent on really contaminated groundwater, where we need local sustainable projects in Southern California and throughout the San Joaquin Valley to improve their conditions. We always stand in solidarity with drinking water groups. And my take for the last 15 or 16 years is that when this question gets raised, it gets weaponized to break apart environmental justice communities that share the same concern from the Oregon border to the Mexican border. And I think that what has to happen is we have to think comprehensively and holistically about managing the system to the best benefit for all people. You know, the fact that we're going to have to share water, we always will, because of where the population is versus where the water is located. But if we're really going to take care of people along the way, we're going to make sure that there's water in the watersheds for the northern rivers and tributaries for salmon economies. We're going to make sure that the Delta is healthy. And we're going to implement with climate change every last project on the ground to make sure that people south of these areas have clean, affordable drinking water. And we believe that local sustainable projects protect all of us.
Thank you, Barbara. And thank you for helping me to see that question in the chat. There's one more. I know we're short on time, but I'd like to read it out. How do you think scientists and engineers working on these issues can bridge the gap with communities? Is there a member of the panel who would like to address that question?
I can speak to that in one sense. The way scientists and engineers truly come to the table in a regulatory standpoint from the tribal perspective is they have to listen to us. And one thing that is continually advocated for is either community benefits programs, panels such as this, which really get it out there, that are brought together, shown to the public, not only to talk within their little science and engineering circles, but to really truly reach out and have open public forums, either in person or Zoom like this, and to really engage the question of what is this project? What can this project do for you? Instead of saying, we're going to do this project, we've decided it because we're experts in this area and this needs to happen because of our understanding. You really need to flip the script and think about how do these migrant communities, how do underrepresented communities, how do these impoverished communities are affected? And if somebody has the power to create these massive projects that affect everybody on this panel and everybody we all touch and talk with, they need to do as much outreach as possible. We all know each other. We all know where each other lives. We all speak to each other regularly, not only the tribes, but these communities. A simple phone call, calling someone up or inviting them to speak on a panel is the best way to do it. And that's what tribes advocate for. We want to speak with other people. We want to speak with our neighbors and the people we cohabitate with.
Thank you, Ivan. I'm mindful of the time. I see that there's a lot of discussion happening on the chat now. I'd like to invite our panelists to go to the chat tool and respond to some of the dialogue that's come through in the last couple or few minutes. Again, I want to thank you all for taking the time to participate today. For the benefit of the audience, there's a 5-minute break. So the workshop will resume at 11:05. This concludes the Social Dimensions panel. Again, thank you all for participating.
Thank you, Michelle. Good to see all of you, especially you, Lenora. We'll get together in the summer.
Thank you, Bill and Jim. It's good seeing you guys. And it's good
to see you,
meeting
Lenora.
Ivan and
On and ready to start. Good morning and welcome to a panel discussion on the challenges, knowledge gaps, and needs for decision support tools related to salinity management. My name is Michael George. I'm the Delta Water Master and for these purposes, more importantly, moderator of a panel discussion. So we've got a large panel, a lot of expertise to bring to bear on the discussion issues this morning. So I'm going to start by simply giving a quick introduction to all of our panelists and then go quickly into the discussion questions, because I do think that we have a number of different perspectives here, and I want to encourage discussion among the panelists. That means, of course, that not everybody is going to be able to offer an answer to each question, but I do want to encourage all the panelists to chime in to add their voices to the discussion. So quickly going through the introductions, starting with Tom Boardman in alphabetical order. Tom is the Water Resources Engineer for the Westlands Water District. Tom works closely with state and federal agencies to monitor CVP operations to maximize the water supply delivered to Westlands. Tom also evaluates how proposed environmental and regulatory actions may affect the reliability of the district's long-term water supply. Next, Dan Can, a climate researcher with Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UC San Diego. Dan researches climate change and regional climate variability. He's a member of the author team which produced Rising Seas in California, an update on sea level rise science. Dan is also a contributor to the downscaled climate projections and diagnostics for California's climate change assessments. Chandra Chilmakuri is the Assistant General Manager of the State Water Contractors. Chandra focuses on numerical modeling of estuarian hydrodynamics and water quality. His specific expertise is on delta hydrodynamics and salinity, and on CVP, SWP operations and the regulations that govern those operations. The state water contractors and Chandra care about how the salinity in delta is managed, especially in relation to the increasing competition for constrained water supplies throughout the Central Valley. Next, Aaron Forsman is the environmental program manager in the State Water Board's Division of Water Rights. Aaron's been working on California Bay Delta watershed issues for the last 20 years. She helped address Southern Delta salinity and environmental flows on the lower San Joaquin River and its tributaries in connection with the State Water Board's 2018 update to the Bay Delta Plan. And Aaron is currently focused on implementing the new and revised flow and salinity objectives, as well as on monitoring, assessment, science, and reporting needed for the ongoing updates to the Bay Delta Plan. Deanna Sereno is, John Leahigh is the Water Operations Executive Manager for the State Water Project within the Department of Water Resources, and we certainly all benefited from John's keynote address. John is a civil engineer with more than 27 years of water operations experience with the State Water Project, which together with the Central Valley Project shares primary responsibility for meeting Delta salinity standards. Deanna Sereno is the Senior Policy Advisor for the Contra Costa Water District. Deanna has over 20 years of experience in Delta hydrodynamics and water quality, analyzing past conditions and forecasting future Delta water quality to ensure Contra Costa Water District continues to be able to provide high quality drinking water to 500,000 people in the Delta and the East Bay. CCWD relies entirely on the Delta for its water supply, and as a result has invested in facilities to mitigate increases in Delta salinity, such as Las Vaqueras Reservoir, an off-stream reservoir that diverts Delta water when flows are abundant and salinity is low, and uses those uses the water when Delta water quality has degraded or water supplies are limited due to drought. Next, Andrew Schwartz is the State Water Project Climate Action Coordinator within the Department of Water Resources. Andrew works with State Water Project Management, other state agencies, public water agencies, and scientists to reduce the State Water Project's contribution to climate change and drive action on adapting to climate change risks facing California's water systems. With nearly 20 years of water resource management and engineering experience, Andrew specializes in climate change impact analysis, management of solutions to address those impacts, and policy development. Next, Melinda Terry is the manager of the North Delta Water Agency. NDWA was legislatively established in 1973 and encompasses approximately 300,000 acres that includes portions of Sacramento, San Joaquin, Solano, and Yolo counties. The purpose of the agency is to enter into agreements with the state and federal governments that protect the local water supply from intrusion of ocean salinity, and to assure the lands within the agency of a dependable supply of sustainable water quality. Since 2008, Melinda has managed the administration of the state's obligations to ensure a dependable water supply with year-round salinity criteria specified in the 1981 contract between North Delta Water Agencies and the California Department of Water Resources. This includes monitoring salinity levels at 7 locations within the agency's jurisdiction. And finally, Kristen White, final only because she's last in the alphabet. She's the operations manager for the Central Valley Operations Office of the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation. Kristen has been working with Reclamation since 2010, focusing on modeling, operational planning, and real-time operations. Her background is in civil engineering with a focus on hydrodynamic systems. So with those introductions, giving everybody in the audience a sense for the perspectives of each of the experts within our panel, I want to go directly into questions for discussion. All of these questions have been presented to the panelists prior to today. They were developed by the planning committee for the workshop. And again, I want to encourage panelists to weigh in and to have a discussion among the various panelists. So the first question is, from your perspective, what do you think are the overarching goals of salinity management within the Delta?
Who's going first?
Anybody who wants to, with 9 panelists, let's just try and do this as spontaneously as possible. So Melinda, you've lit up your screen, and for all the panelists, you can raise your hand in the Zoom function or just wave at the camera or just butt in. But Melinda, you go first.
Thanks. As was mentioned, our agency did reach a settlement agreements with the state of California through a 1981 contract. And but I guess I'll just mention an overarching thing just to start things off. But if you look in state law, Division 6 of the California Water Code says that the first priority is for the provision of salinity control and maintenance of an adequate water supply in the Delta for reasonable and beneficial uses of water, and relegates to lesser priority all exports of water from the Delta to other areas for any purpose. So with that in mind, I think the conversation that I heard on the panel prior, and I think ours, there's a lot of balancing that really has to go on. So I'll just start there and let other people chime in.
Thank you for that, Melinda. And from the regulatory perspective. So Erin, would you like to add to the comments about what are the overarching goals for salinity?
Absolutely. I would, I guess, say that, you know, from a Clean Water Act and a California Porter Cologne perspective, the primary goal and responsibility of salinity management in the Delta is really to provide what we call reasonable protection of municipal, agricultural, recreational, and fish and wildlife beneficial uses in the Delta and also in the Sacramento and San Joaquin River watersheds. Reasonable protection of beneficial uses can be further defined, and we do that in water quality control plans as well as in some permits like D1641. But essentially, it would be meeting the numeric and narrative water quality objectives that are adopted in the Bay Delta Plan and associated regional water quality control plans. If we're meeting those objectives, that's a good indicator that those beneficial uses are being reasonably protected. Having said that, we are in the process of updating Bay Delta water quality control plan and objectives in those plans, primarily due to continuing declines of fishery resources in the Delta as well as in the upper watersheds. But you know, really, when I just think about how to say it very straightforwardly and in, you know, kind of plain language, we protect water quality of exported water supply from the Delta, of diverted water supply upstream of the Delta. We protect water quality for in-Delta water users. That means agricultural, municipal, recreational, and to provide estuary and freshwater habitats for native fish and like the broader aquatic ecosystem. So those are how I would, you know, paraphrase our broad goals and regulatory responsibilities.
Thanks, Erin. And Dan, I see your hand up, so I'm going to call on you next. And then but Dan, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. This is not at all from a regulatory or agency lens. It's from a climate science perspective. But I think improving resilience to extremes is highly critical. The kinds of warming events that we heard about in the keynote and we've all seen in recent years are going to become much more commonplace by mid-century, and eventually they'll be on the lower part of the temperature distribution. Floods, according to climate projections and because of warming, are going to become more acute, more freshwater occasionally from atmospheric rivers and the like through the system. And of course, sea level rise is going to compound some of that. We've dodged bullets recently through the last few decades in avoiding a 1983 kind of situation where we had very high tides, big storms, and an El Nino compounding us, but that is eventually going to recur. So we're going to have problems in the future, and it's a great thing that you all are taking this up.
Thanks, Dan. I understand my audio is not working as well as it should, but I want to go next to Kristen White to give the CVP perspective, and then to John Leahigh for the State Water Project perspective on this question. Meanwhile, I'll try and fix my audio.
Sure, thanks. I think one piece that I wanted to highlight is salinity management is a factor of a highly altered system. So we're not here because we're just simply pushing water out. We're here because we've already modified the entire system with all of our large upstream dams, and in order to make the system suitable for supporting both all of our human development and agriculture, now we have to further manipulate the system throughout the spring and summer and throughout the dry period. So I kind of see it as if, the effects of blocking that water and changing the overall ebb and flow of the system, we're now trying to stabilize so that we can support those major beneficial uses that I think Aaron already went over. So trying to create a more stable system rather than the natural system, which is certainly a lot more varied.
John?
Yeah, I'm trying to get my video on here, but at least I got the, there we go. Yeah, thanks. And of course, I had more than enough opportunity to express kind of my perspective this morning. But, certainly, as far as overarching goal, it certainly meet our regulatory and contractual requirements is foremost in the mind. But also to continue to inform and communicate through forums like this, to shape expectations on, what are the challenges associated with salinity management moving forward, and what are these changes that we are expecting. This should inform, are any investments into the future, do they make sense under the guise of these changes that we are expecting? So it's a very broad topic, very dynamic, but forums like this are really important, I think, in terms of an exchange of information from different perspectives. Thanks.
Thanks, John, and I appreciate that input. And let me just maybe finish this part of it by calling on Chandra Chomakuri from the State Water Project's perspective, and then maybe Tom Boardman, who represents one of the beneficiaries of the CVP. But Chandra, first from the state contractor's perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. Can you hear me okay? Just
yes.
Double check. Okay. From my perspective, I think everyone pretty much explained what the goals are. Obviously, we believe that the salinity management in the Delta should support multiple beneficial uses that are dependent on the water in the Delta, not just in the Delta, but throughout the state, given how important that resource is for the California's economy. I think I also want to point out that there is a continued reduction in the resources we need to maintain or manage that salinity in this modified system. So we need to figure out how to prioritize or rebalance the limited supplies that we are having, because that is the primary tool to manage the salinity in the Delta, as John explained earlier.
And as we go to Tom, this issue of balance is one that we've talked about already several times in this panel, and achieving the right balance often depends on where you sit and what your interests are. Tom, let's ask you to address that.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, I think I've agreed with everything that the panelists have said, and I hear repeatedly, as you just mentioned, Michael, about the balance. And from a district's perspective, from a contractor, CVP contractor south of the Delta, I think the overarching goal would just to see equitable balance in the system. But as part of maintaining that equitable balance, I think it's prudent upon all of us to keep an eye on the moving target, as I think Kristen touched on. With regulations, you've got competing interests or competing goals for many of the regulations that projects have to operate to. And I think it's important to constantly reevaluate some of those standards that we operate to on a day-to-day basis. And one of them, I think at the forefront of my mind, like this year, is the X2 standard, and how that is really costly on the projects, with stored water having to meet a standard. Given to the fact that the X2 standard was basically developed in the 90s and has seen since then several biological opinions come about, I think we're finding that, and we're seeing also a more frequent basis for change petitions for relief on some of these standards because of the conditions of the projects and how things have changed over the last 3 or 4 decades. I think we need to keep those standards constantly reevaluated, and X2 being one of those. And so I'll stop there.
Well, thank you for that. And certainly with respect to the update of those regulations, one of the issues, speaking to a panel primarily of engineers, but as a lawyer, the problem is that renewed standards always draw a lot of litigation. It's hard to maintain those standards as conditions change. Melinda Terry has your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to add on to what he said, the other hat, for those of you that don't know, is I represent reclamation districts. And we have quite a few conversations about, like you were mentioning, older regulations. And of course, we've got flood storage rules in reservoirs. And on our part, there's definitely, because of the newer technologies with forecasting and that we're, willing and interested in and re-looking at, changing that, should they, but at least looking at and considering whether those need to be changed as well. Thanks. I don't know how to make it go off.
Thank you. And I'm still having trouble, I guess, with my audio here. But one of the things that your comment really focuses on is the potential for competition among reasonable goals for managing salinity in the Delta. So I want to ask the panel to comment on your perspective of the competition among those different goals and how to better draw those balances and how to make that balancing process more dynamic. And I guess by that I mean maybe less dependent on what are always cumbersome, time-consuming, litigation-fraught changes in how those management activities are regulated. So any thoughts on that subject? And if nobody else is going to do it, Aaron, I'm going to call on you again because you're kind of in the hot seat with the State Water Board, where you bear a great deal of responsibility for managing those cumbersome regulatory processes.
Yes, not me individually, but the board as a whole. So I guess I could offer just a couple of thoughts on this. And my first thought is that, protecting water quality, and we're specifically focused on salinity today. So protecting water quality in terms of salinity for municipal, recreation, and ag uses, I think all of that it's consistent. It's not in conflict with providing an estuary salinity gradient, or, as Tom was referring to, meeting the X2 and outflow objective that is associated with higher abundance and distribution of native fish in the aquatic food web in the Delta. What it would also, though, contribute is that current demands for water and increasing demands for limited supplies from the Sacramento River watershed, from the San Joaquin River watershed, and the Delta are increasingly in conflict as climate change intensifies, with maintaining adequate reservoir supplies for temperature control and water quality in the upper watershed. So specifically Sacramento River and winter run Chinook salmon, but all runs of Sacramento River salmon, and salinity control in the Delta for municipal, ag, and recreational uses. Sometimes I think the conversation can get very focused in the Delta, and I think this group here will probably appreciate this. The conversation needs to be the Delta and the upper watershed. They're connected, and their actions in the upper watershed absolutely impact the lower watershed in the Delta. And those conflicts between increasing demand for water supplies. And as John went over this morning, we will probably have less supply that we can control in the future due to climate change. So I see those areas definitely increasing in potential conflicts. I think, maintaining salinity control in the Delta is also pretty consistent with having Delta outflow objective that supports aquatic life. And then I think you also asked about tools for addressing these issues, and the Water Board right now is focused on updating the water quality control plan, including voluntary agreements for achieving those updates, implementing those updates. We are in the process now of starting to move forward with implementation of the updated Southern Delta Salinity Objective and with the Lower San Joaquin River flows. Given that the updates haven't occurred for quite some time on the Sacramento and Delta side, these updates will absolutely embrace the more adaptive management style of permit writing that really wasn't in place in the 90s or late 90s, early 2000 when D1641 was adopted. So those are some initial thoughts I can offer, and then see what other panelists have to contribute.
Good, thanks, Erin. And I want to bring Deanna Serrano into the conversation from the Contra Costa Water District's point of view, because as I mentioned in the introduction, Contra Costa Water District is exclusively dependent upon the Delta and has taken a lot of efforts to manage that that sole reliance. So Deanna, in terms of the dynamics of the system and the regulatory approach, you got some comments from CCWD's perspective?
I would like to add that there are some conflicts in the system that are becoming more apparent because of the hydrology we've experienced over the more recent years. So John talked about this year being the driest January to March on record, and I think it was actually January through mid-April. Last year was the lowest inflow to Shasta Reservoir on record, dating back to the 1920s. So as we keep having these superlatives, we run into the situation where we're operating to a system we haven't seen in the past. And I say we, but it's really, John and Kristen with the CBP and the SWP. Such a situation, there can be conflicts between the needs of species. In a year like last year, where there really was very, very limited inflow, we saw the Sacramento River become a losing stream. So in other words, water that was released from the upstream reservoirs, less water showed up in the Delta starting in April, and earlier in April than we ever had before. I think it was 2 to 3 weeks earlier, and Kristen's going to correct me, I'm sure, but it was new, it was different. It was something that we all had to react to. So CCWD has done a lot of planning for variations in salinity. We have the typical drought that California has every year, and CCWD, for that reason, built Los Vaqueros Reservoir and started operating it in the late 90s. And this was before we've seen these more recent severe hydrology that we've had. And the intent with the reservoir was we fill it during periods where there's lots of water in the Delta and salinity is really good. And then later in the year, as salinity starts to intrude, even when D1641 is being met, it's really a salinity burden on our agency. And so we continue to divert a little bit of water from the Delta, but we release water from Los Vaqueros Reservoir to blend with that water to continue to deliver high quality water to our customers. Now, as climate change, as sea level rises increase, as hydrology changes so that we're not getting as much inflow into the watershed itself to provide those natural flows for the Delta and also for the storage to be released to maintain salinity, there's been a bigger mismatch in recent years. And as the projects have relaxed salinity standards with the temporary air density change petitions, it's been a greater need for us, which means that we have to exercise Los Vaqueros Reservoir more extensively. We need to be able to fill it during these peak time periods. And I'm happy to say, that bomb cyclone we had in October was a fill opportunity for us. The Delta got really, really fresh. So the projects worked with us to be able to put some of that water, I think maybe 4 or 5 days, but that's critical to be able to capture those flows. And then reacting to the two UCPs and the increased salinity intrusion that we're seeing now is a greater burden. But I just did want to mention that part of the question was conflicts between the regulations. And in years like last year, where the inflow to Shasta was so low, there is a conflict in protecting the cold water habitat and the threatened and endangered species up on the Sacramento River, and maintaining a cold water pool in Shasta with protecting estuarine species downstream. And so we saw that a little bit last year. It's not just the operation of the projects. I feel both ways on that, but it's not. It really is a situation where the hydrology has an effect, and this is going to continue to change, and we're going to need to adapt to it.
So Deanna, I think that's a great segue to bringing in Andrew Schwartz, because Andrew, your position really is to help the State Water Project adapt to climate change and some of the issues that Deanna has just brought out. So Andrew, from your perspective, this is your job. How are you going to make sure that we've got a reliable supply in the face of climate change?
Well, I think folks have said a couple of really, really important things. I think John said it this morning, and others have said it again here, that climate change is already happening. It's upon us. We've seen 8 inches of sea level rise in the Golden Gate Bridge already. We've seen, as Deanna just outlined, some really extreme hydrologies over the last several years, both on annual time steps and even monthly, and just events that are kind of outside the distribution of anything that we've seen before. And I think it's all leading us toward this more constrained system where everybody is losing a little something. I mean, I think we heard it this morning on the last panel about all of those folks, and you can hear all the things that they feel like have been lost, and beneficial uses of the Delta that we're slowly losing, and it's going to continue to happen. I think we're going to have to continue to re-envision how we manage the Delta and really come up with creative solutions to get us through these extreme events, and take advantage of the extreme events that deliver some additional water that we can move and help and flush HABs and salinity and things out of the Delta, but also capture and put into our reservoirs and get us through these drier times that are coming. And that's going to take all kinds of local solutions downstream of the Delta, to be able to store that water, but also solutions around the Delta to be able to move that water, and upstream of the Delta to create habitat and to create the ability to move water and transfer water and exchange water between participants that makes sense to different folks.
So Andrew, that's helpful, and it really does underscore the need for dynamic management and for cooperation and balancing a lot of different perspectives here. So again, I want to get into kind of how we adapt our management as well as our regulation when there are so many of these challenges where it depends so dramatically on where you sit and what your objectives are. So again, I want to go maybe to Tom and Chandra from the perspective of the beneficiaries of exports. How do you think about and how do you influence that dynamic management in an era, as Andrew has just described and as Deanna mentioned, of significantly constrained resources? So we're going to have to manage more dynamically in a system in which there's less room for error, if you will. Tom, why don't you go first, and then Chandra?
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, as I think through this, and again, my perspective is probably more narrow than some of the other panelists, the project operators, because they've got so many other factors they got to deal with on a real-time basis. But I think it's, from a contractor's perspective, it's about meeting the contractual obligations that exist for the, speaking of the CVP contractors, those CVP contractors, that we have enough water to meet those contractual commitments on a real-time basis or on a long-term basis, given the fluctuations of hydrology and recognizing how that's changing over the last decade or more. But it's, as I think, and I don't want to beat X2 to death, but I think it's a good example of when X2 was developed, it was modeled pretty thoroughly in the mid-90s to try and come up with a standard that was protective of the fisheries and of the drinking water standards and so forth, and minimize the amount of stored water that it would take to meet that standard. And the modelers all recognized that we would have years when stored water, which is imperative to meeting these contractual obligations in those dry years, that we would have those periods when we would have to meet that with stored water. But I think that, again, if we got creative and kind of got out of what I would consider a clunky way of managing a fishery standard like X2 and water quality, and take, maybe it means operating the cross-channel gates a little differently. Maybe it means Sassoon Marsh gates operating a little differently. But we might be able to do it in such a way to where we use less stored water to meet X2, as an example, on a somewhat regular basis, and fulfill more of those contractual obligations to CVP contractors.
So, Tom, before we go to Chandra, I just want to delve a little more deeply into that, because we've seen over the years, because of primarily economic requirements, a real shift toward permanent hard demand on what has always been a variable supply, and where the projects you talk about, the contractual obligations, those obligations have always been modified by what water is available. And particularly now that we're trying to implement the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in a drought, where you've got such constraints on both the major supplies, what about that issue of moderating not just our management in the Delta, but how do we deal with the fact that we've developed a harder, more permanent demand on what has inherently been and is in the contract a variable supply?
Yeah, I think from the water contractors' perspective, the ag service contractors, I mean, we all recognize that they have the least senior position in that water allocation process. And so when we do have issues with insufficient water to export to meet those allocations, certainly that's a given. But what I'm talking about, at least on more directly, would be the contractual obligations by the senior water rights, the exchange contractors, now the refuges, because of CVPIA in 1992. They, as most people may recognize, that they have a minimum of 75% of their contract entitlement during even the driest years. And we're not seeing that happen in these extreme dry years, which then requires them to draw off of Friant water supply from the San Joaquin Exchange type agreements. And then in an era now when groundwater is being more and more regulated through a Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, we're seeing depletions of groundwater from all different types or seniority levels of contractors. So it has a ripple effect through the whole region, and it all comes down to having insufficient water north of the Delta. And, I think if it was managed what we would argue to be more balanced way, that there would be less shortages going on south of the Delta, and primarily to senior contractors. So that's kind of in a nutshell what I would think.
Thanks, Tom. And Chandra, in this circumstance where we're all acknowledging a more seriously constrained cyclical water resource. Give us some of the perspective of the state water contractors to go along with Tom's comments.
Yeah, I think, when I think about salinity management, again, this was mentioned before, but the standards that we have today in the Delta are pretty much from 1970s. I mean, they haven't really evolved, especially for the salinity requirements in the late spring and summer. I think there is a need for us to look at those and reconsider whether can we still achieve the balance that was thought through in 70s and through 90s for the fisheries. Can we still achieve that same balance with what we know about how the hydrology is shifting? Because as John explained, and I think we've discussed at length, it's the same supply that's in the reservoirs that would need to be used for multiple benefits here, right? From water supply to delta salinity, everything is based on the same supply. So when the supply is reducing, we need to figure out what is that, how can we cut on all sides? It's not just, we are not arguing for one thing. I think from Stewart project contractors allocations perspective, they are self-regulating, they are adjusted, as you said, they are variable. They're truly dependent on the hydrology and availability of stored water. Whereas regulations aren't that way. They are rigid. They are stuck in, as I said, mostly from 70s or 90s. And we have to re-examine whether the balance that was established with those regulations, is that still sustainable going forward? We definitely need to think through that going forward.
And of course, as we think through that, we also recognize that in times of shortage, traditionally, it has been the environment that takes the first hit. And in updating those regulations, obviously, and I'm going to go back to Aaron at this point, because in updating those regulations, the board has signaled that they feel a responsibility to adjust the balance in shortage conditions, kind of chronic shortage conditions, to relieve some of that first burden on the environment. So whether it's through adjustments to flows or greater investment in habitat restoration. So Aaron, I'd like you to maybe weigh in on that process of how we take what are granted to be regulatory structures that were developed a long time ago that pretty clearly have needed updating. Talk a little bit about how that balance shift is managed in the updates.
Sure, I'll give that a try. I think so the water quality control plan is being updated in two steps. And the first step finished in 2018. That was updates to the lower San Joaquin River flows and Southern Delta salinity. And that update expressed the flow objective in a different way. It tied it to the unimpaired flow estimation that's provided by Department of Water Resources. And that's a daily unimpaired flow. And right now, most of D1641 and the prior objectives in the water quality control plan are based on water year type. And that's a proportional sum, so kind of like a weighted sum of monthly unimpaired flows, and then, a proportion of last year's water index volume. So there's these 5 categories of water year types, and water quality objectives, flow dependent objectives are placed in one of those, categories of flow requirements, and those are then in D1641. And just thinking of some of the comments that have been made, so those flow objectives and some salinity objectives have been in the water quality control plan, some since 1978, the fisheries objectives, and I think primarily fisheries objectives were updated in the 95 plan and then put in place and implemented through the water rights decision 1641. So we have been in the process of updating those objectives. It's good to hear there's a lot of support on the panel for updating those objectives. We're working on that. Part of that update may include voluntary agreements. As far as how things will adjust maybe more to drought conditions, if a flow objective is expressed as a percent of an impaired flow, that will continuously adjust up and down with flow and hydrology with that particular year, as opposed to being in like 5 discrete categories where sometimes there can be quite a large jump from a flow requirement in a dry year to a flow requirement in a below normal year, or critical to dry. Sometimes if you're at that water year type index volume, that's just below one of those thresholds, and then it's pushed into another threshold, there's quite a large jump into a higher requirement. So adopting a flow requirement as a percent of unimpaired flow has an automatic continuous adjustment. When unimpaired flows are low, then the flow objective adjusts down. When they're higher, it adjusts upward. For the update to the SAC Delta plan, there are reviews of the Delta outflow objective, inflows, interior flows, and the inflows, I think, are evaluating, a percent of an impaired flow approach, but Delta outflow may be looking at different ways of adjusting that Delta outflow. When we released our framework, we identified an inflow-based outflow. And then there's also, a contemplation, and we were recently provided voluntary agreement proposals. So evaluating what is being placed as part of a voluntary approach to contributing to additional outflows. And right now, the voluntary agreement approach, as far as I know, doesn't incorporate what to do with these really critically dry years. So I think we still have the same set of tools in that sphere that we do right now. So we definitely, this is a relevant and very timely conversation to, talk about what are the tools we have during these drought periods. And on one of your questions, Michael, to the panel were, what are some of the challenges associated with salinity management tools and strategies? And something I've definitely heard about here from the other panel members, and then seeing in the chat bar comments that the water board often hears, are things like, right now, salinity has a limited responsibility. It's placed solely on operations of SWP and CDP. That's our primary tool for controlling salinity, while other water diverters are not obligated to contribute to the salinity control or delta outflow. Implementing updates to the water quality control plan will also try to address that issue where responsibility would be more broadly applied. We have definitely, the State Water Board has acknowledged that the currently implemented flow and water quality requirements need to be strengthened. And they think that, looking at responsibility is part of a package of considering all the tools that we have in front of us.
Thanks, Aaron. And Chandra, I see your hands up, so I want to come back to you. But I also think, as we're talking about updating the regulations, going back to Tom's point, some of the contracts that we're talking about are pretty old as well, and were developed, negotiated in a very different context from the one we're operating today. So Chandra, let me give you the opportunity to provide some more input, and then I'm going to go to Melinda Terry.
Yeah, very quickly. Aaron is right that, yes, maybe that the flow requirements you're looking at are, they vary with the flow, actual hydrology and all, but I feel like State Board hasn't really added up the water supply that would be needed to maintain the existing salinity standards to that equation, right? So if we are going to continue to provide more outflow, then where is this water going to come from to meet those salinity standards in the summer when the water is not actually available and it has to come from storage? And you're not looking at the changing those standards hand in hand with what you're trying to do during the times when there is flow available. I think that's what I meant by when we need to, when I say we should think about, the rigidity in the salinity requirements, is that part of, no one's thinking about that right now. And we need to start looking at that. Anyway, thanks.
Well, first of all, I will say that there are a lot of people thinking about it, and a lot of people within the water board and within the broader community. It's a tough issue, and it goes back to something that we've talked about earlier in this panel, which is, the example of competition between regulatory objectives in the instance that was mentioned, between maintaining a cold water pool for use to maintain cold water for incubation of salmon later in the year versus releasing that water to maintain a salinity barrier earlier in the year, and how those two competing uses, those are competing environmental and regulatory uses, not without even getting to the issue of competition between other human uses of water. Having said that, Melinda, let's give you the next air here.
Yeah, and Aaron had started us off on the challenges, but in terms of the competition that you were just talking about for the carryovers, or not carryover, but just storage that exists, a big conflict sometimes is the timing of all of those, right? How they compete with each other in terms of when those are timed. And this last year, we, for the first time, it's fairly common in a drought year, not common, but we occasionally, I should say, in a drought year, we'll get exceedances of our salinity criteria at our 3-mile slough monitoring location. But last year, for the first time, we saw these exceedances occurring at Rio Vista. So it seems like a concerning harbinger. But back on the timing, there's challenges too when you get politics involved in this. I mean, last year the governor was in a recall. We didn't see an early declaration of drought because of that. And this really led to the inability to put conservation mandates on. And as I recall, in 14-15, the public, when you ask them to conserve, they really do. But this time around, even now in 2022, the public doesn't seem to have a sense of urgency because they still haven't met, I don't think, any of the the objectives the governor set for conservation. So, that's, it's that level of uncertainty when on the one hand, we as water managers might know that there's, danger warning signs, it wasn't coming from the top down. And, that's too much heavy lifting for water districts to convince the public without it coming from the top. The other challenge that I would say is it's maybe a perception thing, but there is a perception in the Delta that the water board really just approves TUCPs, almost everything they want. I try to remind them there are conditions, but I think they're concerned or feel that there is not good enforcement of that. So on the one hand, you allow them to relax them, but is it really even being enforced? And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Well, I'm surprised for you to mention politics as a possible impact on water management. That kind of never occurred to me. But then, secondly, the unholy alliance that you claim, I've never seen that act on our decisions with respect to temporary agency change petitions or anything of the kind. So that's a bit of a surprise.
Again, I was conveying it's a perception, right? That because of what they read, the export levels were after the fact, and some, exceedances of water quality. It's a perception.
Well, exactly. And I will say, as the Delta Water Master with responsibility for managing water rights within the Delta, we have had exceedances of the Southern Delta salinity objectives that I have not enforced because, frankly, of trying to do this balance, of trying to figure out how in these very extreme circumstances we should enforce one issue at the potential detriment of another. So that is a real practical issue that I've had to discuss with constituents within the Delta and within the water community more broadly. Must we tolerate some exceedances in some objectives in order to maintain or meet other objectives. So some of that is going on, and it is the fact that within the Water Board, within the Stewardship Council, within the Department of Water Resources, Food and Ag, and elsewhere, there is a lot of discussion of how we manage in this dynamic and constrained and challenged system with all these different interests to keep in mind and manage. So I'm going to ask a couple more questions, but I want to alert the panel that I'm going to give you all probably 2 minutes to summarize here as we're coming toward the end of the panel. But I want to focus on the question of some of the major management strategies that the whole community should be considering as we work into managing this balances in a dynamic, changing, and climate impact affected system. So, and maybe I'm going to go back to the project operators, John and Kristen, and then I'm going to ask Dan, who's got a little bit more perspective sitting in San Diego than maybe the rest of us who are closer to the action. But answer the question, or at least share your thoughts on the major management strategies that we should be considering. And John, let me ask you to do that first, because it really builds on your comments during the keynote.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. Yeah, I mean, so, we talked about this, who is, are we in competition? Well, yeah, certainly we're all in the same boat in some respects as it relates to the supply becoming more scarce. So, how do we alleviate this essentially for everyone involved? And I think one of the answers here is, we do need to be more creative about being able to take advantage of the opportunities when water supply is plentiful. And Deanna talked about this with regard to the Los Vaqueros expansion. That's exactly what that project is attempting to do, is capture these flows when they're excessively large, to improve the reliability in the drier years. And that could be done at a project level, that could be done at a local level. There's a whole host of different projects that fall into this category. You talk about surface storage in terms of some of the WISIP programs, but also groundwater storage. So, for example, some of the WISIP projects, the groundwater conjunctive use programs that will be facilitated by the State Water Project, potentially is capturing some of those wet year flows to produce environmental benefits in the drier years with better chance of sustained pulse flows on the Feather River, for example. So these wet year, dry year trade-offs can benefit all the different parties involved, constituents involved. Flood MAR is another one. Any project that allows us to capture, whether it be a physical project to capture more storage, whether it be south of Delta or north of Delta, but also can we take a look at the existing rules and make software changes. So one of the projects I'm involved with is the forecast-informed reservoir operations for the redoing the flood control diagrams at Lake Oroville and New Bullards Bar. Is there a way can we leverage the improvements in technology on forecasting to hold on to some of those winter flows rather than release them when we have these increased capabilities and still keep or improve the flood benefits that exist, but at the same time be able to capture more of this very precious wintertime flows. So those are sort of the, I think that's where we need to direct our attention, is this wet year, dry year trade-offs.
Thanks, John. And Kristen, do you want to add to John's comments?
Yeah, certainly, and definitely agree with John on kind of looking forward and how to manage this. One other kind of looking at the opposite side of not new projects, but how do we manage it now and where are the challenges with that? Think about salinity management, at least from the project's perspective, is the result of a bunch of other actions, a lot of which are fairly unpredictable. We have some general rules of thumbs, or we have forecasts, we have ideas, but particularly with warming temperatures and drastically changing hydrology, it's very difficult to predict, for example, what depletions are going to be in the system in July now, and the storage that we have now needs to go to those to be able to compensate for those depletions. So, and that's just one example. We've also got how high are the high tides going to come in? How much is that going to push salinity? And when are we going to have a wind event that changes conditions? So ideally, we would take all that variability out and have better certainty, but we know that's not possible. That'll never be possible. So flipping that around of, well, if we're never going to be able to pin those down, then what can we do? And I think kind of going into John's point, but feeding off of that, it's really adding more flexibility to the system to compensate for all of that uncertainty. And what we see often when we get into these drought periods is that people become concerned and organizations and interests become very concerned for their top priority, rightly so. And so they start kind of trying to really limit the flexibility with, I hate to call it their piece of the pie, but their anything around what their interests need. And so when that starts shrinking down, now all the flexibility is gone, and the salinity is still the end result. So it's still coming at the end, but now we're removing the flexibility, which puts us in this very tight spot of having to make very uncomfortable decisions. So I think more flexibility, whether it's with new projects, as John mentioned, or with thinking about different standards, as Aaron mentioned in some of the updates to water quality control plan, but really thinking about how to add flexibility and be able to move quickly when things like a tide that comes in really high, unexpected, or depletions that were 100,000 acre feet over forecast.
Thanks, Kristen. And Andrew, I see you've got your hand up to discuss this, I presume, from a climate change response perspective.
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot, and John just mentioned a lot about capturing the high flows and storing those and reoperating the system to deal with a changing hydrology. I just kind of want to point out that the sea level rise issue, unlike the hydrology issue, doesn't have an upside. It's unidirectional, and it acts like a leak in the bottom of the reservoir, if you will. If we maintain salinity exactly as we have historically, and we have higher sea levels, that's just the net result is a drawing down over time of our reservoirs. And I think the modeling that was done for Delta Adapts and DWR's climate change vulnerability assessment, both of which I was a part of, show that the net result of that is that when you do hit those drought periods, you are far less ready for them. You have less storage going in because you have this chronic drawing down of reservoirs that is kind of independent of the deliveries piece. It's a mass balance of trying to keep that salinity at bay with a higher sea level rise. And I think that's something that we don't really necessarily have an answer for right now, and something that we have to consider kind of in a different way from the changing hydrology piece.
So that leads me to ask Dan to come back in, obviously from his perch in San Diego, but focusing on regional climate variability and so forth. Dan, how do you see these issues in terms of response to the leak in the bucket that Andrew's talked about?
It's an important leak, and one thing maybe of note is that the recent federal sea level rise assessment has to some extent reduced sea level rise estimates in the nearer term, that is the next few decades. The longer term, still pretty dire. West Coast, including California, has been on the light side as far as sea level rise. In many parts of the globe, the Western Pacific has been suffering really impressive amounts of sea level rise, while we've been relatively immune here along the West Coast. So that's something that the state is going to revise their sea level rise guidance in the next year or so. That'll be worth paying attention to. The other thing I'd like to mention is that it's not so clear that in the long term that the water bearing areas of California will really have diminished supplies in the long term. I think most modeling projections are indicating that there's increased volatility, so there would be dryness, and there will be spells of dryness. There will be this whiplash that's been referred to. And John mentioned this, and Andrew mentioned the importance of managing high flows. I would just point out that there's a wonderful book by Robert Kelly called Battling the Inland Sea that we're not escaping that. We're gonna, if anything, we're gonna have a bigger battle as time goes on, because snow lines are increasing. And another thing that I don't think has been mentioned very much today is the fact that climate projections are becoming more winter-centric in our natural water delivery. The shoulder seasons in climate models are declining as far as their amount of precipitation, drier springs, and to some extent drier autumns. So all that puts a fine point on the ability to manage, and also the importance of forecasting, not only longer term projections, but forecasting by way of managing flows. I think John mentioned the FURO forecast informed reservoir operations. Things like floodmark depend on water pooling in areas and so on. So I think we really have to support these efforts to increase our skill at subseasonal timeframes, as well as seasonal timeframes, to understand what's going to be coming at us in the shorter term. I think I'll leave it at there and let you have time for others. Thanks.
Thank you, Dan. And just as we reflect on the need for greater flexibility in the system, and FIRO and FloodMar and all these tools that we may be looking at, it strikes me that one of the things that challenges us is the balkanization of how we're managing the water supply. And to the extent that we were going to think about reoperating our reservoirs, not just, as John talked about, saving as much winter water as we can, but maybe using the reservoirs as a way to slowly allow water to get into our vacated groundwater basins. One of the problems with that is, if you've got a contractual supply that's in the reservoir, you think of it as money in the bank. As soon as it comes out of the reservoir and goes into a groundwater basin, even if we've got a net benefit, we change who the potential beneficiaries are. And that is one of the downsides in terms of trying to manage a system more flexibly, as Kristen quite rightly pointed out. So we're coming close to the end. I think, Deanna, you're going to get the last word here.
Goodness, I don't know that I deserve the last word, but I want to thank the panel. I think everyone's done a great job of talking about the tools and opportunities. The thing that I don't know was mentioned was something that Laurel mentioned at the very beginning, which is the possibility of building restoration projects that help mitigate salinity intrusion. Where we place a restoration project, how it's connected to the system can have a good effect on salinity and help us manage it. And the other thing I wanted to mention is that as a municipal provider inside the Delta, we are taking all of our planning activities to be able to address increased salinity intrusion, recognizing it could come. So we're looking at desalination, brackish desalination. Someone from the first panel mentioned that Antioch was already doing that. Interties with other Bay Area agencies so we can address different problems. So we're working internally, but that doesn't change the fact that that is to adapt to if salinity increases. Preparing to be able to still provide good drinking water to our customers. That doesn't address the fact that the Delta, a freshwater Delta, is used for all these additional purposes that people talked about today. And so there are other questions I would pose to others, such as, are there possible things in the watershed that could be done that could both be good for fire mitigation as well as reduce demand in the forests? So I would kind of look to those types of mutual benefit solutions as well to try to help our situation.
Thanks, Deanna. And I want to thank the entire panel. This has been a great discussion. I also want to respect the audience that we've got, because trying to pay attention to what's in the chat, we've got a lot of experts out there who have suggested things, whether they were questions or proposed responses to questions. So I want to continue the discussion, notwithstanding the fact that we've reached the time limit of this panel. Thank you all. I've learned a lot. It's a weird thing to have a lawyer trying to moderate engineers, because usually it's the engineers who have to moderate the lawyers. So I've done my best, and I've had a lot of help from all of you. So thanks very much.
Thank you so much to all the panelists and to Michael for excellent facilitation. Just a couple of quick reminders to the folks that are in the audience. This meeting will reconvene at 1 p.m. for our next round of activities. We hope you stay logged in, and if anyone wants to stay on the chat, you're welcome to continue to converse about the questions that have been coming up in the chat. And just a technology note, I think that if you sign out of Zoom and then sign back in, you lose the chat history. So you might just want to stay on and monitor what's going on in the chat. And I would welcome any of the panelists to look through and see if there are other questions or comments that pertain to your work that you might inform with a response, or that you might be informed by. Thank you, everybody, and see you at 1.
And Karen, I just want to make sure the Stewardship Council is maintaining the chat, right? We're not going to lose all that stuff. I understand if we go out and come back in, we'll lose it on our machine.
Right.
But I mean, I just think some of the stuff in the chat is going to be food for all of us for a long time.
Yeah, we'll not be posting this in any way, but we will include it in our note taking so that we can synthesize some of those points when we present back notes.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
1 o'clock. Ready to jump back in. Right. Hope everybody had a nice break there after really what I found interesting and invigorating morning session. Welcome back to the afternoon. My name is Chelsea Batavia. I'm a senior environmental scientist in the Adaptive Management Unit of the Delta Science Program, and I'm one of the co-organizers for this event. I'm just here to do a fairly brief, or very brief, introduction to the first of 2 breakout sessions that we're going to hold throughout this workshop, one today and one tomorrow. This breakout session is going to be focused on understanding the diverse priorities and values around salinity management. Could I get the slides up, please? Perfect, thank you.
Great. So as I mentioned, this is going to be very short, but if at any time you do have questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat, and I'll have time to answer those at the end. Next slide, please. Thank you. So our overarching objectives for this breakout are relatively simple. We're here to share, to listen, and to learn. As Karen and Laurel covered this morning a little bit, this workshop series was designed with the understanding that there is a lot that we currently don't know about salinity management, including how it affects people. And we had a chance to learn from some really stellar panelists at the morning session today, but we also recognize that we are joined by many other participants here who represent a truly remarkable breadth of personal and professional experience and a great diversity of perspectives on delta salinity and salinity management. So these breakout discussions will provide the opportunity for you all to share that experience and those perspectives. That's for us not only valuable to generally build understanding and awareness among participants and organizers, but it will also integrally inform the evolution of this conversation around salinity management, particularly as it crystallizes throughout this series of workshops into the summer and the fall. We have a few main topics we're going to explore in the breakout. We're showing those on the screen here. I'll read them through to you. First, to understand the values and perspectives of people in the room. Second, to understand how salinity management leads to benefits and harms and for whom. And third, to understand the risks that are associated with broader environmental changes, largely in the suite of climate change impacts. Each room is going to have a designated moderator to lead you through these questions and a note taker to capture a record of the discussion. And as Karen mentioned this morning, to facilitate open discussion, we will not be recording the breakout sessions. So please do feel at ease and comfortable speaking your mind. Next slide, please. Before sending you off in a second, I'll quickly walk through the schedule for the rest of today. So in a moment, we're going to 2:30, and then you'll have a 15-minute break. At 2:45, please rejoin this main meeting using the same link that you've used throughout today. And at that time, we'll hear reports from all of the breakout rooms, and we'll have time for a larger group discussion and debrief before wrapping up for the day. Are there any, I don't see any questions right now, I don't think, but are there any questions about the breakouts? Alrighty. Would it be possible to join a breakout group via phone? I'm going to pass that one. It's a good question. Thank you to Brandon and Beck.
Yeah, if you call in, it should be able to move the phone over with you. I already see one phone number that I was able to sort into a room, so it should move you over there.
Thank you, Brandon. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions, so I think we are ready to go. I hope everybody has a wonderful discussion, and we'll see you back here at 2:45.
In your breakout. And thank you for starting the recording. So we're going to hear from our 5 different breakout groups now and invite a little bit of dialogue as well during this time. So I am going to do this in this order. I will start, and then I'm going to have Sam Bashevkin report out from Karen Kayfetz's breakout group, and then Rachel Wigington from Chelsea Batavia's breakout group, and then we'll hear from Laurel's group and Stephen Elser's group. So just so the reporters are ready, we'll go in that order. So in our breakout group, we had a great discussion, as I'm sure many of you did. And I'm going to try to summarize it and then give some time to the participants to talk about anything that I may have missed. So when considering, I also want to thank Rachel Klopfenstein for doing the note-taking during this discussion. When it comes to benefits and harms of salinity management, one theme in our conversation was that it's important to think about the baseline. For example, there was a comment about needing to keep in mind the full historical context of salinity conditions in the estuary. And that we also maybe don't have all the tools for understanding the impacts, particularly from a socioeconomic perspective, and really gauging exactly what the harms or benefits may be to certain groups. But we do have really good tools for evaluating salinity, modeling salinity, and getting even improving tools on effects of sea level rise and other effects of climate change. So we are missing some tools with respect to socioeconomic impacts. And a theme in this conversation too was that it is important to be improving our science tools, but also needing to have the perspective and understand that understanding the impacts is one thing, but there are a lot of decisions to be made, a lot of policy calls to be made. And doing that is not always a wholly scientific exercise. However, there was acknowledgement that we could use more science in order to guide our decision-making process. But we also felt that we lacked this process for fully understanding the trade-offs of different salinity management choices. One theme in the discussion was that, in particular, we may not have tools for addressing and understanding equity. There was an acknowledgement that the current water rights system comes from, and it was set up in a time, first in time, first in right, comes from a time when we had even more inequity than we have now. For example, there was a comment that at this time women were not allowed to own land. So we are using this current system as a way to make decisions about salinity management now, and that is not in step with our current value system. So another theme in our discussion was about the need for process and the need for there to be a safe space to play out different salinity management scenarios. So several folks in the room noted that some ideas that may come forward, and again, we need to be thinking out of the box, not as we're facing unprecedented conditions. We need to have a space and tools to think about how and play out, using even modeling tools that we have, how we can, what are the outcomes of those different salinity management scenarios. So for example, certain aspects of forest management in the headwaters may impact water supply. How do we play that out? Or if you change the delivery structure for a different set of constituents, then how does that play out in terms of water supply and impacts? But that we may be lacking a space for doing that in a low, without fear of repercussion or without fear of litigation. So there's a need for that safe space for these thought exercises and planning that we need to do. There was hope that this workshop process, that in series of events we're planning through the rest of 2022 will provide some space for that. With respect to additional changes and kind of multiple stressors coming at us from the changes with climate change, we talked about how we have not fully considered emergency situations, emergency events, changes that could happen very rapidly in the event of a large earthquake or a major flood, and how that could then change our salinity management scenario. And we have not yet fully modeled those outcomes, or maybe have the tools to do that as well as we would like to. And we need to be doing this in a risk evaluation sense that would be holistic and include socioeconomic impacts, and we just don't yet have those tools. I think those are the main points and themes that I wanted to bring forward. Oh, there's one more that I'd like to say, and sorry that I think all the reporters are doing this a bit on the fly after a long, expansive after an expansive conversation, but there was also an important point that in our water rights decisions and kind of when we face these difficult unprecedented situations of low water, increasingly limited supply of water, then some of these decisions are made without considering all of the emergency uses that are needed and kind of baseline levels of needs and emergency supply needed for the different scenarios that we're going to be faced with. So that was another factor that we thought needed more help and more of a process for identifying where those needs are and how to meet them. So with that, anyone from my group that would like to expand or build on that?
And if you want to jump in, you'll have to do so by raising your hand so that we can give you
thank you for
permission to unmute.
Karen, that we don't have the floor. Yes, so please go ahead and add anything to the chat that you would like to. So there's a new message. Thank you, OSHA. Dylan, just want to note Dylan Chappell. And I'm not sure, Dylan, if I'm seeing chat from our small conversation or if this went to everyone, but in addition to these supply side considerations, demand side water use efficiency questions are also highly relevant. Los Angeles is moving towards much higher percentages of water recycling, for example. So yes, incorporating these, how we're thinking outside of the box, and these even some local changes in water management and water new ways of providing water, like water recycling, how are those entering into our water supply modeling tools? Okay, so as we go through the report outs, please feel free to add questions in the chat. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Sam Bashevkin, who's going to report out from Karen Kayfetz's group.
Thanks, Louise. Hi, everyone. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm Sam Bashevkin. I'm a senior environmental scientist at the Delta Science Program. I'm just going to try to go through some of the main points that I found when I was furiously typing the notes. But then, like Louise did, we can have space for anyone to add on to it at the end. So one of the first things we talked about is the issue of whether we really do have enough knowledge at the moment to understand which communities are most affected by salinity management and how. We also talked about how we often think of salinity management in terms of extreme drought, but it's more than that because we're not always in drought, even though it might feel that way. And keeping the interior delta fresh has many benefits to many communities. We also need to think not only about the solutions to our current problems, but farther into the future to take a broader perspective and make sure that our solutions are lasting, especially when they come with big price tags and on top of impending changes like sea level rise. The delta is a created thing that we humans have built. So we need to look beyond just water management to more structural changes. Or on the other hand, maybe to more smaller scale local changes. An example of that for flood management is putting houses on stilts instead of raising levees. We need resources and investments to create solutions. The Delta is underfunded federally compared to similar systems nationwide. The human dimensions of salinity management in the Delta are felt beyond the Delta, similar to the question that I think Darcy posed in the first maybe panel discussion. And Delta salinity management is a statewide issue, but of national importance. And then who will be hurt depends on the specific solution, but everyone will be hurt in some way by salinity management. And like Louise mentioned, we're also hampered by the old legacy systems like water rights and contracts that didn't consider equity when they were first built. Someone mentioned that there was an area in Australia that did actually redo their entire water rights system, but it was extremely expensive and it took huge environmental and agricultural damage before it was even started. So it took a lot of damage before there was the movement to make it actually happen. It's really important, especially with climate change and sea level rise and many other things going on, that we have to consider multiple factors and not just salinity. Salinity is a consequence of many of our actions, but also interacts with many other things that are changing as well. And last but not least, we need to do a better job of including Delta residents in these conversations.
Thank you, Sam. Any questions for Sam?
I see Andrew already
Andrew
clarified the
Schwartz has
idea.
his hand up. Okay.
Okay.
You can go ahead and read Andrew's comment from the chat.
Okay. I think the idea was that everyone will be hurt by the change in hydrology, not that salinity management would hurt everyone. Okay, good clarification. Thanks for that. Okay, so if there are no more questions for Sam, then we'll move to Rachel Wigington to report out from Chelsea Batavia's group. Hi, Rachel, we can see you.
Good afternoon, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Rachel Wigington. I am the Senior Environmental Scientist at the Sacramento San Joaquin Delta Conservancy. And I will just highlight some of our conversation from Chelsea's breakout group and then leave time for other folks in the group to chime in if I've left anything out. So we had a really nice discussion. Some of the key things that stuck out to me were ideas about salinity variability in the historic delta, and how a lot of our management of the system in the more recent past has been to decrease the variability of some of these systems. So when we're thinking about layering on a new salinity management plan on top of that, it can be a little bit difficult to think about how we can maintain the ability to have that variability, and also some of the other important functions of the system. Another thing that came up specifically around incorporating salinity management into some of our other activities in the system, thinking about how landscape scale restoration or other changes in the geometry of the system, for example, sea level rise adaptation, might be utilized to play into some of our other hoped for outcomes for salinity management. And then we had a pretty broad ranging discussion on sea level rise generally and how this is a really major stressor that impacts salinity in our system. And we all kind of agreed it was a really, really hard thing to manage for. So I'd be interested in other folks from my group if they want to expand on any of that. We also had a really great discussion on how, when we're thinking about changing how we're managing the system, thinking about how that is going to have different impacts for different people spread across the system. So some of the equity things that have been brought up by some of the other groups' report outs. So thinking about how management actions are not going to be uniformly, just like Sam was saying, they're not going to be uniformly harmful or beneficial. Some of that is going to be different across the larger landscape of the Delta. And then figuring out how to balance those trade-offs is going to be really important, and thinking about how we can have flexible management plans that will allow us to respond to either new information or extreme events. And then just a conversation around our deep desire to make sure that the communities that are going to be most vulnerable to the influences of changes in future management are also included in the planning and consideration of what we're going to be putting forward.
Thank you, Rachel. Any comments or questions for Rachel? Daniel Armstrong, so your hand is raised. Perhaps you can put your comment in the chat.
Daniel was in our breakout group with us.
Okay, so
he
might
has
have a build on what your report was. Well, while we're waiting for Daniel's comment, then let's hear from Laurel's group, and I think Christine Kabugao is going to give that report. Okay, Christine, we'll come back to you. Thank you for that. Unless Beck, if you're able to, oh, you can fix that, Brandon. Thank you. And so Daniel states that, just adding that Rachel's last note was about Delta communities. Thank you, Daniel.
And Christine should be able to unmute herself now.
Hi, Christine. We can see you.
Thank you so much, Brandon.
Okay, now we can hear you.
So much of the benefits and harms, I think, have been covered, but a few of the ones that were shared by my group were that many of the benefits from salinity management have to do with trying to protect the human demand for fresh water, farming, diversion, and exports. But there were potentially many unforeseen consequences of trying to manage for multiple needs, which I think has been brought up by several of the breakout groups. And that one of the potential harms could potentially be decreasing project yields, including also impeding boating and recreational use. And then many of the regulatory rules around managing salinity can sometimes create rigidity to the system that makes it less able to adapt to changing climatic conditions. So a lot of our discussion did focus on those regulations, and specifically that there are legal requirements that state water projects and water managers have to meet, which require them to focus on in-delta uses first. So there are legal requirements that have to be met prior to considering export needs. And then on top of that, there's also some natural conflicts because state water permits and state water contracts were signed that have effectively over allocated the water, and that's something that's been happening for quite a long time. And so until those are addressed, there will always be this conflict between water allocation because the water has been promised. I think the number that was given was over twice of the amount of water that is actually coming into the Delta. And then we focused a lot on whether or not we had, sorry, I think one of my group members has raised her hand. Sorry, Deidre, let me just finish this up and then I'll pass it over to you. And then we talked a little also about how some of the compliance mechanisms for setting salinity requirements can actually impede salinity management in terms of where they're actually located, whether or not they're representative of the spatial dimensions of the Delta. And so I will stop talking so that Deidre can share her comment.
Deirdre, are you able to unmute? Oh, looks like you are. Please go ahead.
I wanted to thank Christine for her summary. I just wanted to add, so there's a concept of firm yield, and it's one of the measurements of water supply, water reliability. And firm yield is what a project like the State Water Project can provide in a dry or critically dry year. And so that's what the water reliability of the State Water Project is low because the original project is based on the assumption they'd be augmenting the flow of the Sacramento River by over 900,000 acre feet. And that just never happened. And so the contracts are based on that assumption, and the contracts are over twice what the firm yield was estimated. So it's this creates an enormous conflict with the environment. And one of the ways of dealing with it is to try and do salinity barriers and so on. And this is actually originally proposed in 1960. But an alternative, which I mentioned in the breakout room, was that the State Water Project looked at alternative definitions of reliability for, the areas that are using Delta exports, and that might include alternative water supplies. And this is something environmental groups have been advocating for 30 years, because we need to distinguish between harms. There's economic harm, which is temporary and remediable, and there's extinction, which is permanent and can never be remediated. So, it is, when we talk about harm, we need to really look at whether they're equal harms, and also at the mandate that the principle of reasonable use and the public trust shall be the principles of state water management. And we need to respect that in these conversations.
Thank you for that, Deirdre, and thank you, Christine, for your report. Please continue to add your comments in the chat as they come to you. And we'll go to our last report out from Stephen Elser's group. I believe Tabitha Birdwell is going to report out for us. Hi, Tabitha.
Hi, yes, thank you, Louise. So our group had a very interesting and in-depth discussion about various topics. But I think an overall takeaway from the group is that there's a lot of uncertainty, as has already been stated from other groups, but it's a certainty that we're going to need to continue inclusive conversations on these various things, such as solutions and regulations and collaborations. But what it's also need to be discussed is what kind of stakeholders and what kind of sacrifices and priorities that will have to be decided, not only for the current priorities in the Delta, but also the future ones, considering the adaptations and the changes and uncertainties that will come with climate change and new regulations and new voices that come across the Delta. Other things that were brought up in a similar context is that we need to not let old systems kind of prevent us from these new collaborations, opportunities, and solutions. And we need to create incentives for opportunities for change and participation from various groups that currently haven't had as strong as a voice in the Delta for these salinity issues and regulations as they could have had in the past. We also spoke extensively about the strategies that need reevaluating and rethinking. And of course, we didn't have enough time to create a brand new salinity strategy for the Delta and ourselves. But we did talk about a couple ways we could do that as a starting point. First of all, we kind of, as a technical group, realized that we're missing the policy voice from some of the more policy-oriented people, as well as the regulation people, despite that we do have some experiences in that innovation opportunity as well. One of the big inhibitors to making these better effective strategies for the climate change, the salinity issues, and solutions that have various trade-offs for various groups and beneficial harms and all those complicated factors is that we're talking past each other rather than with each other. And we need to have agreements on the science and the regulation level for these effective solutions, not only start making short-term changes, but these longer-term changes. And I think that was particularly reflected in a conversation we had towards the end about the environmental change and the risk with it, with drought and sea level rise. We were discussing the changes that had happened a couple decades with levees in itself. They started out not being great, older science, older techniques of engineering, but they made improvements in the year, but they still need improvements as our group is discussing. But this focus to push for these new changes kind of gives us this hope that there is opportunities and success in past collaborations that could guide the future collaborations needed to find the salinity management collaboration and strategies issues in this new age of vast stakeholder collaboration. But everything else I'm going to exclude because it would be repetitive in the last few debriefs and last few groups. But I welcome anyone from the group to add on.
Stephen, please go ahead. Hi.
Yeah, thanks. Great summary, Tabitha. Thank you for that. Just building off of what Tabitha's already said, another point that I wanted to make sure came across is we talked about how, as a technical group, we know a lot about the metrics that I guess we're used to tackling. So things like habitat for different fish or outflows from the delta. So we know a lot about those sorts of metrics, but we don't know as much about the metrics that environmental justice communities in Stockton might care about, or metrics that tribal communities might care about. And so we need to do more work to identify what those metrics are and be very explicit about including those metrics in our designs and how we can incorporate those metrics into modeling exercises in the future. So just thinking more holistically about the suite of tools at our disposal and yeah, how we can think more holistically to achieve more positive futures. So thank you again, Tabitha, for a great summary.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to all the reporters for distilling some of the major points from your discussions. I think everyone, it's just interesting to see the themes that come out across our different breakout groups. We have, in summary here, 94 people that participated in breakout groups. And it's really interesting to hear these report outs. And I'm just going to note a couple of themes really quickly. Please feel free to continue using the chat, but just I did notice that there were themes of needing a process to maintain stakeholder engagement and to keep the stakeholder voices in the room. That was one point that came up in my group that I think I failed to bring forward earlier. And I heard that from other groups as well. We also, I think, had a theme in our discussions of recognizing that there is inequity baked into our system, and how to address that may not be something we yet have tools to do, but that underlying our path to understand those inequities, and then to be able to model them and even name them and then even quantify them is something we need more social science work to do. So Stephen just talked a little bit about that, the need for metrics on socioeconomic issues to bring those forward and actually model out what happens under different salinity management scenarios for some of the environmental justice issues that were raised today. Some of this, I think the process piece really was a theme that Tabitha said it very well. We're talking in some cases past each other, not with each other. And there was a comment even in my group that we need to have a two-way dialogue. Scientists and environmental justice advocates, all of these groups need to be listening very well to each other and having a real meaningful dialogue where we're speaking the same language. And it's going to take work and time to get there. And we do hope that this workshop can be a forum for that, recognizing that there's a lot of work to do. So with that, I am checking the chat for any additions, and I'm not seeing anything. So I am going to invite Karen to come and provide more closing words. And thank you again to all the people that participated in breakout groups, all the facilitators, all the note takers, and all the reporting out folks.
Thanks, Louise. Excellent job moderating this section. Really appreciate it. So Beck, can you put my last slide up here, the very last slide of the day one? I just wanted to thank you all for your participation today. We heard from so many of you about your perspectives and the issues that matter to you. You're in presenter view, Beck. All of these things that we've heard today will inform our larger process to move forward thinking about this complex issue. Okay, still not screen sharing the right slide, Beck, but that's okay. I just wanted to take this moment, and maybe you don't even need the visual because you've seen it. I was just going to project the at a glance agenda one last time so that we could focus in on tomorrow while I close out today. So this is just a reminder and an invitation for your continued engagement into the next day of this workshop. When we reconvene tomorrow, we're going to hear from Dr. Laurel Larsen and Senior Environmental Scientist. Thank you. That's the right view. Thank you. And Senior Environmental Scientist, Dr. Stephen Elser, about a pilot exercise to model some effects of potential future climate and salinity management scenarios. So there'll be about an hour of presentation of those scenarios and that concept first thing in the morning. And then we're going to have another round of breakout discussions, this time morning time breakout discussions while we're all energetic and caffeinated. We'll spend that time in the breakout groups discussing the pilot scenarios and getting your feedback on the proposed exercise and gathering input on what metrics matter to you and how we can model or measure those. In the afternoon, after lunch, we will reconvene to hear reports from those breakout groups, and then we'll transition right into a closing panel discussion. That panel will be discussing creating an adaptive management framework for managing salinity, and we have some really interesting perspectives on that. So definitely come in and join us for the afternoon as well. And then just a reminder that the presentations and the panel discussions are being recorded, so you can watch them at a later time if you're unable to join us live. Thanks again, everybody, for your participation, and have a great evening.
Thank you, Karen.